Welcome to Road Horror Stories, Vol.3. Today we've a good selection for you and we'll make sure you enjoy the content. Subscribe before you fall asleep. The Endless Highway. The gas station was the last sign of civilization for miles, its flickering neon sign buzzing faintly in the oppressive silence of the desert night. Ryan, tired from hours of driving, filled his tank and glanced at the desolate stretch of road ahead. His GPS had stopped working an hour ago, and his phone had no signal. He was too far gone to turn back now. The clerk inside the station, a gaunt, sunken-eyed man, watched Ryan closely as he paid for the gas. "You headed west?" the clerk asked, his voice gravelly and low. Ryan nodded. The clerk hesitated, then added, "Don't take the shortcut. Stay on Route 89, no matter what." Ryan frowned but didn't respond. The shortcut was clearly marked on his map, promising to shave 2 hours off his journey. The clerk didn't understand. Ryan wasn't just running late. He was running away. The shortcut was a narrow, winding strip of asphalt that cut through the barren desert like a scar. The road was eerily empty, the only sound the hum of his tires and the occasional rustle of wind. A strange unease settled over Ryan as he drove. He told himself it was just the isolation, but the feeling grew stronger with each passing mile. It started with the signs, or rather, the lack of them. There were no mile markers, no exit numbers, nothing to indicate where he was or how far he'd traveled. His headlights caught glimpses of the desert around him, but it seemed wrong somehow. The landscape never changed. The same twisted shrubs and jagged rocks passed by again and again, as if he were driving in circles. Then came the car. At first it was just a pair of headlights in his rearview mirror, distant but steady. Ryan didn't think much of it until the car began gaining on him, fast. Within moments, the other vehicle was tailgating him, its high beams blinding and aggressive. Ryan honked, waving for the driver to back off, but the car didn't budge. Its engine roared as it veered to the left, then to the right, swerving dangerously close to his bumper. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Ryan shouted, gripping the wheel tightly. The car suddenly surged forward, pulling up alongside him. For a brief, horrifying moment, Ryan glanced at the driver and saw nothing. No face, no figure, just an empty seat behind the wheel. The car swerved toward him, forcing Ryan to jerk the wheel sharply to avoid a collision. He lost control. His tires screeched as his car spun, the desert spinning around him in a blur. He came to a stop in the middle of the road, his heart pounding in his chest. The other car was gone. Ryan sat in stunned silence, trying to catch his breath. The air around him felt heavier now, thick with an oppressive stillness. When he glanced at the road, his stomach dropped. It wasn't the same. The pavement was cracked and uneven, overgrown with weeds that hadn't been there moments ago. The sky was darker, the stars obscured by a swirling haze. The desert around him seemed alive, the shadows shifting and writhing just out of sight. He started the car and sped forward, desperate to escape, but the road stretched on endlessly, twisting and turning in impossible ways. The same landmarks, an old rusted sign, a gnarled tree, appeared over and over, no matter how far he drove. The radio crackled to life, spewing static and faint, disjointed voices. He turned it off, but the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, filling the car with whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You shouldn't have come here," Ryan screamed, slamming his fist on the dashboard. The headlights flickered, then went out completely, plunging him into darkness. When the lights came back on, he was no longer on the road. His car sat in the middle of a vast, empty expanse of sand. The road, the signs, the twisted shrubs, they were all gone. In the distance, a figure appeared. It stood motionless, silhouetted against the dim horizon. Ryan froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure began to move toward him, slow and deliberate. As it approached, Ryan saw its face, or rather, the lack of one. Its features were blurred, like a smudged painting, its eyes empty voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. Ryan hit the gas, but the car didn't move. The engine roared uselessly as the figure drew closer, its distorted form towering over him. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, filling his mind with fragments of words and thoughts he couldn't understand. His vision blurred, the world around him dissolving into a chaotic swirl of noise and darkness. The last thing he saw was the figure reaching for him, its hand stretching impossibly long, pulling him into the void. The next morning, a passing trucker found Ryan's car abandoned on Route 89. The driver's seat was empty, the engine cold. The trucker glanced at the empty road ahead and muttered a prayer before driving on. No one ever saw Ryan again. The road stretched under Kara's car, a black ribbon winding through an endless forest. She'd left the main highway to save time, following an outdated map found in her grandfather's old atlas. It was supposed to cut 2 hours off her journey, but now, hours later, the shortcut felt like a mistake. The sun had dipped below the horizon long ago, leaving her headlights as the only source of light. The deeper she drove, the more oppressive the silence became, pressing against her like a tangible weight. Every mile ahead seemed like it led deeper into nowhere. Her phone was useless, displaying no signal for the past hour. The headlights carved through the dense darkness, illuminating little more than the narrow road and the skeletal silhouettes of trees. Then she saw it, a figure standing by the roadside. Kara's heart skipped. The figure wore a long, tattered coat, their face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. She slowed instinctively but didn't stop. As her car crawled past, she realized the figure wasn't facing the road. They were staring directly at her through the windshield. Her chest tightened. She hit the gas, the car jerking forward as the figure disappeared into the darkness behind her. The shadow they left in her mind lingered. Minutes later, Kara spotted a sign half hidden in the brush. Welcome to Black Hollow. Population 0. A chill swept through her. Why would anyone put up a sign for a town with no one in it? She swallowed her unease and pressed on. The road funneled her into a small, deserted town. The faint glow of broken streetlights illuminated cracked asphalt and boarded-up windows. Kara's headlights swept across faded signs on decrepit storefronts. One read, General Store. Another was so weathered the letters were unreadable. At the edge of the strip, a gas station loomed like a beacon. Relief surged through her. She pulled in, the tires crunching over gravel. The pumps looked ancient, rusted and stained, but intact enough to work. Kara climbed out, pulling her jacket tight against the icy wind. Grabbing the nozzle, she felt the air shift around her, almost imperceptibly, like a presence brushing past her. She froze, her ears straining. A sound reached her, soft and distant. Whispers, faint, like wind rustling through leaves, her fingers trembling as they gripped the pump. The shadows seemed to stretch longer around her, creeping closer with every passing second. "Hello?" she called out, her voice small and shaky. No answer came, only the soft, insidious whispers growing louder. She dropped the nozzle, scrambling back to her car. Once inside, she locked the doors and started the engine. The headlights cut through the gloom, revealing the faint outline of figures standing at the edge of the light. Their shapes were wrong, distorted, and utterly still. Kara's breath hitched. She floored the gas pedal, the car jerking forward and leaving the station behind. The figures didn't move, but she could feel them watching, their gazes boring into her even as she fled. The road stretched endlessly again. Kara's pulse refused to settle as she drove faster, the forest blurring into an oppressive wall of darkness. She glanced at the rearview mirror, but the road behind her seemed to dissolve. It was as though the town had swallowed itself. Her headlights flickered. For a heart-stopping moment, darkness engulfed her. When they came back on, a figure was standing in the middle of the road, the same one she'd passed earlier. Kara screamed and swerved, the tires shrieking as the car careened off the pavement. The impact with a tree sent a jolt through her body, the airbag exploding against her chest. Gasping, she reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Then she saw them. Figures emerging from the forest, their movements unnatural, like jerky shadows in the corner of her eye, pale and featureless, yet somehow watching her. The whispers returned, no longer soft but deafening, like voices pressed directly against her ears. Kara clutched her head, her screams drowned out by the cacophony. The things circled her car, their hands clawing at the windows. They didn't break the glass, but instead seemed to absorb the light around them. Kara's last conscious thought was of the sign, population 0. She realized it hadn't been a warning. It had been a promise. When her car was found days later, it sat abandoned on the edge of the road. The interior was coated in frost, the windows fogged with faint outlines of handprints. The town of Black Hollow was no longer marked on any map. The engine of Santiago's battered truck roared against the stillness of the night. He'd taken a detour after finishing his last delivery, convinced the shortcut would get him home faster. The map sitting on the passenger seat showed a straightforward route, but the reality was far from it. Each passing mile dragged him deeper into a maze of cracked asphalt and oppressive shadows. It was 2 a.m., but time had become meaningless. On either side of the road loomed a forest of gnarled trees, their branches twisting into claw-like shapes against the starless sky. The road was rough, each pothole jolting the truck violently. His gas gauge hovered dangerously close to empty, and he hadn't seen a single sign of life in hours. Then, a faint light appeared in the distance. It flickered like a dying flame, casting a weak yellow glow over the road. Santiago slowed the truck, teetering between hope and suspicion. As he approached, the light revealed a figure standing in the center of the road, holding an old oil lantern. The man wore strange clothes, as though from another century, a tattered vest and woolen trousers. He didn't look up as Santiago brought the truck to a halt a few feet away, leaving the engine idling. He honked the horn, but the figure didn't react. "Do you need help?" Santiago shouted, his voice echoing in the silence. The man raised the lantern, illuminating his face. Santiago's breath caught in his throat. The man had no eyes, only hollow sockets that seemed to consume the faint light. Panicked, Santiago slammed his foot on the gas. The truck surged forward, missing the figure by inches. In the rearview mirror, he saw the man still standing there, unmoving, watching, or so it seemed. The road began to change. The painted lines disappeared, and the asphalt turned uneven and cracked, as though the road had been abandoned long ago. The forest grew denser, the branches intertwining to block out the little light that remained. Then his radio crackled to life. It had been off since he'd left, but now it emitted a low static, followed by faint, garbled whispers. He tried to turn it off, but the dial wouldn't budge. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice trembling. Ahead, the headlights illuminated a fork in the road. It wasn't on the map. To the left, the path descended into a narrow, shadowy tunnel. To the right, it climbed a mist-covered hill. Santiago hesitated before choosing the hill, hoping for a clearer view of the area. As he ascended, the truck began to sputter. The headlights flickered, and the engine stalled. "You've got to be kidding me," he groaned, pounding the steering wheel. He stepped out into the cold night, grabbing a flashlight and the aluminum bat he kept for emergencies. The silence was suffocating, broken only by a faint buzzing hum in the distance. Lifting the hood, he found nothing obviously wrong. Then he felt it. The road beneath his boots began to vibrate, as though something massive was approaching. He swung the flashlight around and froze. In the distance, figures emerged from the darkness. They were tall and emaciated, their limbs impossibly long. Their skin was translucent, pulsing with dark veins. Panic surged. Santiago clambered back into the truck, twisting the key desperately. The engine coughed once, twice, and roared to life. The creatures were closing in, their movements erratic yet unnervingly deliberate. He floored the gas, but the road had transformed. The trees were gone, replaced by an infinite expanse of black. The buzzing grew deafening. Suddenly, the road ended. Santiago slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop at the edge of a yawning void. The creatures surrounded the truck, their hands leaving black, tar-like smears on the windows. One climbed onto the hood, its face pressed against the glass, its hollow eyes locking onto his. Santiago screamed as the truck was dragged into the abyss. Days later, the truck was found abandoned at the edge of a forgotten road that didn't appear on any map. No trace of Santiago was ever discovered. David drove alone down a desolate highway, eager to get home after a grueling business trip. His GPS had lost signal hours ago, leaving him to navigate by memory and intuition. The night stretched endlessly, with no cars, no towns, and no signs of civilization, only the oppressive darkness of the wilderness around him. At a faded junction, his headlights caught a hand-painted wooden sign, "Shortcut to Eldermoor, 5 miles." Eldermoor was the town closest to his home, and David, tired and impatient, turned without hesitation. The new road was narrow and poorly maintained, riddled with cracks and patches of dirt. Trees lined both sides, their branches reaching across the road like skeletal fingers. The air seemed heavier here, thick and suffocating. After 20 minutes, he noticed something strange. No matter how far he drove, the odometer barely moved. He checked his phone, but it was dead, despite being fully charged earlier. Then, a sharp thump jolted the car. David slammed on the brakes, heart pounding. He stepped out with his flashlight to investigate and found a shredded tire. A jagged piece of metal protruded from the rubber, gleaming dully under the beam of light. Cursing under his breath, he popped the trunk for the spare. That's when he heard it, a soft, rhythmic crunching of leaves coming from the woods. "Hello?" he called out, gripping the tire iron tightly. No response. The forest was eerily silent now, the kind of silence that felt alive. His nerves prickled as he worked quickly to change the tire, all the while glancing over his shoulder. Once back in the car, he locked the doors and accelerated down the road. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in tighter with each mile. And then he saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. David swerved violently, the car skidding to a stop just short of hitting the figure. It was a woman in tattered clothing, her face obscured by long, matted hair. She didn't move, didn't flinch. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" he asked, rolling down the window slightly. She lifted her head, revealing hollow, empty eye sockets. David's stomach lurched as she let out a low, guttural wail that echoed through the trees. He didn't wait for another sign. He hit the gas, swerving around her. In the rearview mirror, he saw her standing motionless, her head tilting unnaturally as she watched him drive away. The road changed. The asphalt turned to dirt, and the dirt gave way to loose gravel. The car's headlights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. David's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel. He spotted a distant light ahead, faint but steady. Desperate, he sped toward it. The light grew brighter, revealing an old gas station that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. He pulled in and jumped out, shouting for help, but the place was deserted. The pumps were rusted, the windows boarded up. Still, the light inside the station flickered dimly, beckoning him. David approached cautiously, peering through a crack in the boards. Inside, he saw a figure slumped over the counter. It was himself. Panicking, he stumbled back toward the car, only to find the woman with no eyes standing beside it. This time her wail was deafening, shaking the very ground beneath him. The shadows from the forest surged forward, swallowing the car and the gas station. David ran blindly into the woods, branches tearing at his clothes and skin. He didn't stop until he reached another road, lit by an ominous red glow. His relief was short-lived as he realized it was the same road he had entered hours ago. The wooden sign now read, "No escape, Eldermoor." David screamed as the red light engulfed him, and the road disappeared into the abyss. It was past midnight when Marcus finally left the small town of Clearwater, heading home after a late shift at the hospital. The highway stretched out before him, an endless ribbon of cracked asphalt under the pale glow of his headlights. He hadn't planned on taking this route. The GPS had failed him again, and now he was stuck on the old road that cut through the hills. The fog rolled in thick, swallowing the road ahead, but Marcus wasn't worried. He had driven through this stretch of highway hundreds of times before. It was quiet, lonely, and far from any real danger. At least, that's what he used to believe. As the miles passed, the fog grew denser, and the air inside his car seemed colder. His breath formed little clouds in the dim light, and he could barely make out the shapes of trees looming on either side of him. That was when he noticed something in his peripheral vision. a figure standing by the side of the road. At first he thought it was just his tired eyes playing tricks on him, but as he drew closer, the figure became clearer. It was a woman, dressed in a long white gown, her face obscured by long dark hair. She stood unnaturally still, staring out into the fog. Marcus slowed the car, unsure of what to do. He wasn't the type to stop for strangers in the middle of nowhere, but something about this woman felt different, almost wrong. He reached for the door handle, intent on asking if she needed help, but just as he did, she turned her head slowly and looked directly at him. Her eyes were wide, black, and empty, like two hollow voids that seemed to draw him in. Panic surged through Marcus. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal, speeding away from her. His heart raced, and his mind screamed at him to drive faster. He dared not look back. But then something strange happened. In his rearview mirror, he saw the woman again. She was no longer on the side of the road. She was standing in the middle of the highway, her arms outstretched, blocking his path. Marcus slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car came to a halt just inches from her. His breath caught in his throat. The woman didn't move, didn't flinch. She simply stood there, her face now inches from the windshield, her empty eyes staring straight at him. Frozen in place, Marcus couldn't bring himself to drive away. Something about her presence paralyzed him, as if some unseen force was holding him there. Suddenly, the woman's mouth opened wide, unnaturally wide, as if her jaw could stretch beyond human limits. A low, guttural sound escaped her throat, something between a scream and a laugh, vibrating the air around him. Her head tilted at an impossible angle, and Marcus felt his mind begin to unravel. His hands gripped the steering wheel, but he couldn't move. In a flash of instinct, he floored the accelerator, the car lurching forward and speeding past her. He didn't look back, not even for a second. The fog seemed to dissipate slightly, but the air still felt thick with dread. As Marcus sped down the road, his heart still pounding, he thought he saw headlights in the distance. It was another car, a black sedan, coming toward him at a high speed. For a moment he considered pulling over to warn the driver, but something stopped him. The sedan came closer, its headlights blinding, and Marcus tried to focus, to make out the shape of the car's driver. But the car passed too quickly, and as it did, a cold, familiar chill washed over him. In the rearview mirror, the sedan had vanished. But there was something else. The woman. She was sitting in the back seat of his car. Marcus froze, his eyes wide with terror. Her hollow eyes met his in the mirror. She smiled. The highway stretched endlessly before him, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the desolation of the desert. Jake's car sputtered and slowed, its engine giving one last pitiful cough before dying completely. He was miles from the nearest town, and the only thing on the horizon was the faint outline of an old radio tower. Grabbing a flashlight and his phone, Jake stepped out into the chill of the night. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. As he approached the tower, the flashlight flickered and a faint static crackled from his pocket. Pulling out his phone, he realized it wasn't static. It was a voice, faint and distorted, like a half-remembered dream. "Help! Trapped!" Jake froze, heart pounding. There was no signal out here, and the voice wasn't coming from any app. It repeated, clearer this time. "Please, come closer." Compelled by equal parts fear and curiosity, he reached the base of the tower. The structure loomed above him, rusted and abandoned, but a faint light flickered at its summit. The voice continued, now more desperate. "Don't leave. I'm so cold." Against his better judgment, Jake began to climb. The ladder creaked with each step, a sound swallowed by the oppressive silence around him. As he neared the top, the light blinked out, plunging him into darkness. His flashlight refused to turn on, but the voice didn't stop. It was right in his ear now, soft and almost tender. "You're almost here." Reaching the platform, Jake found it empty, just a rusted floor and the remnants of old equipment. Then he noticed the markings etched into the metal, a circle with jagged symbols, pulsing faintly as though alive. The voice was no longer pleading. It was triumphant. "Thank you for coming. You're exactly what I needed." Before he could react, the floor beneath him began to writhe, the symbols glowing brighter. The air was filled with whispers, too many voices to decipher, and a terrible weight pressed against his chest. Jake screamed, but the sound was swallowed as the markings flared one final time, and he was gone. When search parties found his car days later, the engine was intact, the tank full. The only clue was his phone on the passenger seat, endlessly playing a loop of static and faint, ghostly laughter.
The road stretched endlessly into the night. Its asphalt cracked and faded beneath the glow of faded headlights. Lisa tightened her grip on the steering wheel, the rhythmic hum of her tires the only sound cutting through the oppressive silence. Her phone, mounted to the dashboard, displayed a flickering GPS map, the bright red, no signal bar mocking her. "Just a shortcut," she muttered under her breath. "Save a couple of hours. Stupid idea." The moon hung low in the sky, casting a sickly pallor over the desolate landscape. Nothing but endless rows of skeletal trees lined the sides of the road. They bent and twisted in the faint breeze, their branches clawing at the sky like desperate hands. The isolation felt suffocating. She hadn't seen another car in hours, and the static on the radio had become an unwanted companion. Every station she tried offered the same grating buzz. She finally switched it off, letting silence settle like a heavy blanket. As the miles ticked by, her unease grew. The scenery outside began to repeat. First, she thought it was her mind playing tricks on her. A particular gnarled tree or a cluster of rocks looked eerily familiar. Then she passed an abandoned gas station with a broken neon sign. 30 minutes later, the same station appeared again. Her foot eased off the gas and she slowed to a stop. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but it looked no different from the miles she'd just traveled. She opened her phone again, hoping for even the faintest bar of service, but the screen remained empty. A faint sound broke the silence, the rhythmic tap of footsteps on asphalt. Lisa's breath caught in her throat, and she snapped her head toward the rearview mirror. The road was empty. She rolled down the window, straining to hear. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving only the oppressive silence in its wake. She rolled the window back up and locked the doors, her heart hammering. As she pressed the accelerator, the headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road ahead. It was motionless, its face obscured by shadows, but the way it stood, too still, too rigid, made the hairs on her arms stand on end. "Move!" she shouted, gripping the wheel tightly. The figure tilted its head unnaturally to one side, then the other. Slowly, deliberately, it raised an arm to point directly at her. Lisa slammed the car into reverse, her tires screeching as she backed away. But when she looked behind her, the figure was there too, standing in the road where she'd stopped minutes ago. They were identical. She was trapped. Panic crept up Lisa's spine like a cold, slithering hand. She frantically looked around the car, searching for any escape, but the roads around her were endless and empty. There was no turning back, no way forward. Her eyes flicked back to the figure ahead. It hadn't moved, but she could feel it watching her, waiting. The eerie stillness pressed against her chest, the air growing thick with something far more sinister than the usual nighttime quiet. The tapping sound returned. The footsteps, now unmistakable, echoed from the darkness just behind her. Her eyes whipped to the rearview mirror. The figure was still standing where she had last seen it, motionless, but there was something else now. Another shape had appeared, moving quickly along the shoulder of the road. A shadow darted across the beams of her headlights, its shape contorting unnaturally as it ran. Lisa's breathing became shallow. She turned the wheel, her heart racing as she attempted to speed past the first figure. But as the headlights swept over it again, the face was now visible, or at least what should have been a face. A pale, smooth surface. No eyes, no mouth, just an empty void where a person's face should be. It stared at her, lifeless and unblinking. Lisa gasped and slammed on the brakes, her hands shaking as she tried to regain control. She needed to go. She needed to get away. The darkness outside was closing in, and she could feel the oppressive weight of something ancient pressing against her. She threw the car in reverse again, her foot slamming the gas pedal with desperate force. The car shot backward, tires screeching, but the figures were still there, their shapes lingering in the headlights like ghosts trapped in a place they could never leave. In her panic, Lisa didn't notice the patch of slick black ice beneath her tires. The car slid to one side, veering toward the trees. She gripped the wheel, attempting to right the vehicle, but it was no use. The steering wheel jerked violently in her hands, sending the car spinning out of control. Her heart pounded as the car spun through the icy night, its headlights flashing erratically across the dark landscape. The car finally slammed into something solid, a tree, but not just any tree. This one was enormous, its bark twisted and black, almost like it had been waiting for her. The impact left Lisa breathless, her head spinning from the sudden jolt. She tried to collect herself, blinking against the dizziness, but the world outside was no longer what it had been. The trees around her were moving. They didn't sway with the wind. They shifted, as though they were alive. Their branches stretched out, as if reaching for the car, clawing toward her in an unholy dance. Her breath caught in her throat as the tree she had crashed into started to twist and groan, as though it was alive, too. Lisa didn't wait to see what would happen next. She unbuckled her seatbelt, her hands fumbling as she desperately pulled herself free from the wreckage. She pushed open the door, her body shaking from shock, and stumbled out into the cold, icy air. She didn't look back as she ran, her feet slipping on the slick ground. The night around her was pitch black, the only sound the crackling of trees shifting and the echo of footsteps chasing her, each one growing closer, faster. Somewhere, in the distance, she heard a voice, a whisper, a name. Lisa. She froze mid-step, the chill of the night creeping under her skin. She whipped around, her breath coming in ragged gasps. No one was there. She turned back toward the trees, her eyes scanning the dark shapes looming ahead. The air smelled wrong, like decay and rot, and Lisa could feel the weight of something pressing against her chest. Her pulse raced. The whisper came again. Lisa. It was closer now, louder, a voice she knew, but that wasn't possible. It wasn't just a voice. There was something else in the air, something ancient, malevolent, that had been waiting for her. And as the first figures emerged from the darkness, their faces still blank and empty, Lisa knew one thing with terrifying clarity. There was no escape. Lisa's instincts screamed for her to run, but her body betrayed her. She stood frozen, staring at the figures advancing from the shadows. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as though they were marionettes being controlled by some unseen force. The voice called her name again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a chorus. Multiple voices, overlapping and echoing, each one a distorted mockery of familiarity. Lisa, Lyisa. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the trees and crawling into her ears. She clamped her hands over her head, trying to shut it out, but the voices only grew louder, filling her mind with their insidious chant. The figures surrounded her now, their faceless heads tilting in unison as if studying her. One of them raised an arm, its movements slow and deliberate, pointing toward the twisted black tree where her car lay crumpled. Lisa's gaze followed the gesture, and her stomach churned. The car was no longer just a wreck. It had become a part of the tree. Its metal frame had fused with the bark, its windows coated in a slick, black sap. The headlights flickered weakly, like the last breaths of a dying creature. The tree itself seemed alive, its branches writhing like snakes. From the base of its trunk, something oozed, a dark, viscous substance that pooled around its roots and crept toward her. The air smelled of sulfur and rot, and Lisa gagged, stumbling back. The chanting stopped. Silence fell over the forest like a heavy blanket, suffocating and oppressive. Then the tree groaned. Lisa watched in horror as the bark split open, revealing a hollow cavity. Inside, something moved, a pulsating mass of shadows and light, swirling and twisting in ways that defied logic. From within the cavity, a hand emerged. It was not human. Its skin was translucent, its fingers too long and jointed in unnatural places. The hand gripped the edge of the hollow, pulling something out. Lisa turned to run, her feet slipping on the icy ground, but the figures were there, blocking her path. They closed in, their featureless faces tilted toward her. She screamed, her voice echoing into the night, but it was swallowed by the forest. The thing from the tree stepped out. Its body was like smoke, shifting and reforming with every step. Where its face should have been, there was only a swirling void. It reached toward Lisa, and for a moment, everything around her seemed to stop. The wind, the figures, even her own breathing. The world froze as the creature's hand hovered inches from her chest. Then it touched her. Lisa's scream died in her throat as a searing pain erupted in her chest. It wasn't physical, it was deeper, as though the creature was reaching into her very essence, pulling something out. She fell to her knees, her vision swimming as the world around her blurred and darkened. The creature tilted its head, as if curious, and withdrew its hand. In its palm, something glimmered, a shard of light, pulsating faintly. Lisa gasped, clutching her chest, but the pain didn't subside. The figures began to chant again, their voices low and rhythmic. The sound reverberated through the forest, growing louder and more intense, until it felt as though the very ground beneath her was shaking. The creature raised the shard of light above its head, and the chanting reached a crescendo. Lisa tried to stand, to fight, but her body wouldn't obey. She could only watch as the shard dissolved into the void where the creature's face should have been. The forest went silent again. The figures turned and began to dissolve, their forms dissipating like mist. The creature stepped back into the hollow of the tree, its form merging with the shadows. Lisa collapsed onto the cold, damp ground, her vision fading. As the darkness closed in, the last thing she heard was the trees groan, like a door slamming shut. Lisa woke to an eerie stillness. The chill in the air was sharper, biting into her skin. She was lying in the same spot where she had collapsed, but the forest felt wrong. The trees were still there, but they no longer looked natural. Their trunks spiraled unnaturally, and their branches twisted into jagged shapes that clawed at the sky. The ground beneath her was soft, almost spongy, and pulsated faintly with each breath she took. Her chest still ached, but when she placed a trembling hand over it, she felt nothing unusual, no wound, no mark. Yet, something inside her was missing. The absence was palpable, like a part of her soul had been carved away. She staggered to her feet, her legs trembling, and turned toward the tree where the creature had disappeared. It was gone. The gnarled black trunk had smoothed into an unnaturally polished surface, reflective like obsidian. She caught her distorted reflection in its surface, pale, disheveled, and utterly foreign. Her eyes looked hollow, their usual spark replaced by a faint, unnatural glow. A sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, like the whisper of wind through leaves, but it grew louder, becoming a chorus of whispers. Words overlapped, some intelligible, others garbled and wrong. Lisa turned in circles, trying to pinpoint the source, but it was everywhere. Return. The shard, the phrase repeated, weaving through the cacophony, sinking into her mind. She clutched her head, trying to block it out, but the whispers only grew louder. They were coming from the trees, from the ground, from inside her own head. Lisa stumbled away, desperate to escape, but no matter where she turned, the forest closed in around her. The path she had been following was gone, replaced by endless rows of warped trees. The whispers followed her, relentless and growing more insistent. Ahead, a faint light flickered through the trees. Hope surged in her chest, and she pushed forward, crashing through the underbrush. As she drew closer, the light resolved into the glow of a dilapidated gas station, its flickering neon sign barely illuminating the clearing around it. She ran toward it, her breath hitching with relief. The door creaked open as she shoved her way inside, slamming it shut behind her. The station was empty, its shelves lined with dusty cans and faded labels. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Hello," Lisa called out, her voice hoarse and trembling. No response. The whispers didn't follow her inside, but the silence was no comfort. She approached the counter, her eyes scanning the dim room for any sign of life. A faint movement caught her attention. Behind the counter, a figure sat slumped in a chair, its back to her. Relief flooded her chest as she stepped closer. "Please, I need help," she said, her voice cracking. The figure didn't move. "Hello." Lisa reached out, her hand trembling, and touched its shoulder. The figure turned slowly, its head lolling unnaturally. Lisa screamed. The face was wrong, its features distorted and rearranged as if someone had molded it like clay. Its eyes were wide and empty, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. The figure raised an arm, its fingers contorting as it pointed at her. "Return the shard," it rasped, its voice layered and inhuman. Lisa stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. The room seemed to warp around her, the walls bending and stretching as the figure rose from its chair. The neon sign outside flickered, casting jagged shadows that danced across the walls. Lisa turned to run, but the door was gone. In its place was a black void, pulsating with the same dark energy as the tree. The figure advanced, its distorted grin widening. "Return the shard," it repeated, its voice echoing in her mind. Lisa backed away, her eyes darting around the room for an escape. Her gaze landed on a mirror hanging on the wall. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her. The reflection's eyes glowed brighter, and its lips curled into a malicious smile. "Give it back," the reflection said, its voice overlapping with the whispers. Lisa clutched her chest, a cold realization washing over her. The shard wasn't something she could return. It was inside her, a part of her now. The whispers grew deafening, the room spinning as the walls closed in. The figure reached for her, its fingers inches from her face. The last thing Lisa saw before the world dissolved into darkness was her own reflection. Grinning as it whispered, "You belong to us now." The void consumed her, but Lisa didn't die. She awoke somewhere else, if the wake was the right term. The sensation was disorienting, as though she'd been pulled through a sieve and reassembled imperfectly. She was standing in an expansive landscape, lit by a blood-red sky that churned with liquid movement, like veins pumping ink. The ground beneath her feet felt unsteady, squirming as though it were alive. Distant, jagged spires loomed in every direction, their tips piercing the unnatural sky. A hollow, aching noise emanated from those spires, like a chorus of groans bleeding into the atmosphere. The sound made her teeth ache. Lisa staggered forward, her legs weak, and found herself on what resembled a pathway, if it could be called that. The ground here shimmered like cracked glass, reflecting not her own face but shifting images of strangers with wide, terrified eyes. Ahead, a figure emerged, walking with an unnatural gait, limbs moving in sharp, disjointed movements. It wasn't human, or at least not anymore. Its torso was twisted into impossible angles, and its face was blank, no eyes or mouth, just smooth, stretched skin. It stopped, its head tilting toward her, sensing. She froze, her breath hitching. Her body screamed for her to run, but something deeper, the same thing that had taken root in her chest, kept her in place. The figure raised an arm, its hand outstretched toward her. From its palm, thin tendrils of shadow began to snake toward her. They moved like they were alive, whispering incoherent phrases as they drew closer. Lisa stumbled back, finally snapping out of her paralysis, but the path behind her was gone. The glassy surface now reflected only her, but not as she was. Her reflection was twisted, her skin pale and stretched, her eyes black voids. The tendrils lashed forward and wrapped around her arm. Pain. Not physical, but something deeper, as though her memories were being siphoned away. She tried to scream, but her voice came out hollow, lost in the oppressive air. "Return what you took." The voice wasn't hers. It echoed from inside her head, layered with so many tones it felt like a roar. "I didn't take anything," she gasped, but her words felt meaningless. The entity didn't care. More tendrils reached for her, coiling around her torso and lifting her from the ground. She thrashed against them, but the harder she fought, the tighter they squeezed. "Return it," the voice repeated, and this time she saw the source. Above the spires, the sky opened like a gaping wound. Something emerged, a shape that defied comprehension. It was vast, so large it seemed to press against the edges of her mind, threatening to tear it apart. Its surface writhed with countless eyes, mouths, and limbs, each one moving independently. Her vision blurred, her consciousness fraying under the weight of the entity's presence. Then, a sudden, sharp sound cut through the chaos, a bell. It was faint but clear, its resonance vibrating through her very core. The tendrils recoiled, and she fell, landing hard on the pulsating ground. She struggled to her knees, gasping, and looked toward the sound. Far in the distance, a small structure stood, a decrepit chapel, its steeple bent and broken. The bell tolled again, louder this time, and the tendrils writhed, retreating further. Lisa didn't think. She ran. The ground shifted beneath her, pulling at her feet, but she didn't stop. The chapel seemed impossibly far, but the sound of the bell guided her. The whispers faded with each step, replaced by the rhythmic chime. The air grew colder as she approached the chapel, her breath visible in short, desperate gasps. The door hung ajar, creaking with the wind, and she pushed her way inside. The interior was sparse, the walls lined with peeling paint and strange symbols carved into the wood. At the center stood an altar, and behind it, a cloaked figure. The figure turned, revealing a face hidden in shadow. It raised a hand, and the bell stopped. The silence was deafening. "You've brought the shard," it said, its voice neutral, calm, but layered with something ancient and powerful. Lisa clutched her chest, backing away. "I didn't bring anything. I don't even know what this is." The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating. "The shard was taken. Cannot remain within you. It will destroy you, and then it will destroy everything else." "I didn't take it." Lisa's voice cracked, tears streaming down her face. "You did not take it," the figure agreed. "But you hold it now, and it will not let you go." It gestured toward the altar, and Lisa saw it clearly for the first time. A pedestal carved from bone, its surface pulsating with the same dark energy she had felt in the forest. "Place your hands upon it," the figure commanded. Lisa hesitated, but the whispers were returning, louder and angrier. The walls of the chapel began to shudder, cracks forming in the wood. The entity in the sky was closing in, its massive form blotting out the crimson light. "You have no choice," the figure said. Lisa hesitated, her heart pounding against her ribs. Her hands trembled as she stepped toward the altar, drawn by an invisible force. The figure watched silently, its shadowed presence as immovable as the spires outside. The whispers grew louder, crashing against her mind like tidal waves. The air itself seemed to ripple, carrying with it a sense of urgency. Whatever was coming, it was moments away, and the figure at the altar offered the only reprieve, however sinister. "Place your hands," it repeated, though the words no longer came from its mouth. They echoed inside her head, a command laced with inevitability. Lisa's fingers brushed the surface of the bone pedestal, and the moment they made contact, a searing pain shot through her body. She screamed, her voice ripping through the oppressive silence of the chapel. The shard revealed itself. From her chest erupted a faint, crystalline glow, a piece of something ancient and broken. It shimmered with an iridescent hue, pulsating with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. She felt the weight of its power, its presence so immense that it threatened to consume her entirely. The figure reached out, its long skeletal fingers stretching toward the shard. But the moment it touched the light, the chapel exploded in sound and fury. The walls shattered outward, splinters flying into the void. The spires outside quaked, collapsing into the pulsating ground. Above them, the entity in the sky shrieked, a sound that tore through reality itself. Lisa fell to her knees, clutching the shard as if it were her lifeline. The cloaked figure loomed over her, its calm demeanor unbroken even as the world crumbled. "It cannot stay," it said. "The shard belongs to the beyond." Lisa shook her head violently. "No, if I let it go, I'll die." "You were dead the moment you touched it," the figure replied. The entity's massive form descended, its countless eyes fixated on the shard. Its limbs extended, reaching toward the chapel's remains. The whispers became a deafening roar, a cacophony of voices demanding, pleading, threatening. Lisa scrambled backward, her mind racing. If she gave up the shard, would the figure truly let her go? Would the entity stop, or would its wrath spill into the world she'd left behind? "Choose," the figure said, but the choice wasn't hers to make. The shard flared brightly, its light swallowing everything around her. Lisa screamed again, the sound lost in the blinding brilliance. The entity roared, its massive form halting in mid-descent. The light carved through its limbs, severing parts of it that evaporated into smoke. And then silence. Lisa found herself standing on the same road where it had all begun, the forest still and quiet under a pale moonlight. Her hands were empty. The shard was gone. She turned, expecting to see the cloaked figure or the monstrous entity, but there was nothing. Only the endless stretch of the road, winding into darkness. Yet something lingered. A faint scar burned on her chest, and with it a whisper, a voice faint but familiar. "It's not over." The road ahead shimmered unnaturally, the asphalt rippling like disturbed water. She took a tentative step forward, her legs unsteady but driven by a force she couldn't explain. The road stretched endlessly into the night, and Lisa realized with a sinking dread that she might never leave it. The first signs of trouble were subtle. The absence of any other cars on what was supposed to be a busy highway, the unusual stillness of the surrounding forest, and the faint hum that seemed to emanate from the pavement itself. Alex adjusted his rearview mirror, hoping to catch the distant glow of headlights behind him, but the road remained shrouded in darkness. The hum grew louder as he continued, a low, vibrating drone that seemed to burrow into his skull. It wasn't the engine. He turned the car radio off and rolled down the window to confirm it. The sound wasn't mechanical. It felt alive, pulsing in rhythm with his own heartbeat. Ahead, the road split into two lanes. The right-hand path continued through the forest, the trees arching over like an ominous canopy. The left veered into an open plain, stretching out toward distant, jagged hills. Neither route looked familiar, though Alex had driven this way dozens of times before. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as indecision gripped him. There were no signs, no markers to guide him. Even his memory of the area betrayed him now. He couldn't recall these hills or this particular stretch of trees. The hum spiked suddenly, a sharp frequency that sent his stomach twisting. He winced, gripping his head with one hand as the car veered slightly. When he regained control, the two paths had somehow blended into one, their distinctions erased as the road reformed ahead. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. The asphalt began to shimmer, as if covered in a thin layer of water. Alex slowed the car to a crawl, leaning forward to peer through the windshield. The surface seemed to ripple, distorting his reflection in the headlights. He stopped the car entirely, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But when he glanced in the rearview mirror again, the road behind him was gone. Not just obscured by darkness, gone, replaced by an endless black void. Panic clawed at his chest as he fumbled with the door handle. He stumbled out of the car and onto the road, his shoes sinking slightly into the unnaturally soft pavement. The hum now filled the air around him, vibrating through his bones. Alex looked ahead. The road extended infinitely, its shimmering surface curving upward in the distance, defying logic and physics. He hesitated, but standing still felt more dangerous than moving forward. He climbed back into the car, every nerve in his body screaming at him to wake up, to snap out of whatever dream or nightmare this was. With a deep breath, he pressed the accelerator, and the car rolled forward, its tires hissing against the pliable road. The hum grew louder, almost melodic now, and he realized it wasn't just a sound. It was a voice, no, multiple voices, chanting in a language he couldn't understand. Ahead, the horizon began to shift. The hills warped and stretched, their jagged edges twisting into impossible shapes. The air thickened, making it harder to breathe, as if the atmosphere itself was rejecting him. Alex tightened his grip on the wheel. He could feel the road beneath him starting to change. It wasn't just soft anymore. It was moving, undulating like waves on the ocean. Then he saw them, shapes emerging from the shimmering surface, humanoid but grotesque, their limbs too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. They rose like apparitions, their features obscured by the wavering air. One stepped directly into the path of the car. Alex slammed on the brakes, but the creature didn't flinch. It stood motionless, its head tilted as though studying him. And then it smiled. The smile was wrong. Too wide, too many teeth, the corners of its mouth curling upward in a grotesque parody of human expression. Alex's chest tightened, a primal fear seizing him as the creature tilted its head further, its neck bending at an impossible angle. The car trembled beneath him, the road undulating like a living thing. He shifted into reverse, intending to back away, but the rearview mirror reflected nothing. The void loomed behind him, infinite and impenetrable. The creature moved. Not a step, but a flicker, a disjointed shift forward, as though reality had skipped a frame. Its smile remained fixed, its eyeless gaze locked onto Alex. He hit the gas. The tires screeched, but the car lurched forward only a few feet before something stopped it cold. A shudder ran through the frame, and Alex's head snapped forward, smacking the steering wheel. Blood trickled down his nose as he looked up, dazed. The creature was standing on the hood, its limbs extended, bending in unnatural ways as it leaned toward the windshield. The glass cracked under the pressure of its weight, spiderweb fractures spreading outward. "Go away!" Alex screamed, slamming his fists against the dashboard. The creature's mouth opened wider, its teeth stretching impossibly long, jagged and glistening. The chanting voices in the air grew louder, synchronizing with the hum that had now reached an unbearable pitch. Alex grabbed the door handle and shoved it open, tumbling out onto the rippling road. The ground was warm, almost sticky, and it seemed to pull at him as he scrambled to his feet. He turned to run, but the road stretched endlessly in every direction. There was no car behind him now, no void, just more of the shimmering, undulating asphalt. The creature's laughter, if it could be called that, echoed in the air, a distorted, grating sound that made Alex's skin crawl. He looked back to see it crawling off the hood of his car, its limbs moving like a spider's, each motion jerky and unnatural. Without thinking, he bolted. The chanting grew louder, the words now sharp and guttural. The air itself seemed to press against him, resisting his every step. The road beneath his feet rippled violently, throwing him off balance. Ahead, figures began to rise from the asphalt. Dozens of them, no, hundreds, each one grotesque and malformed, their eyeless faces turned toward him. "Stop," one of them said. The voice was layered, overlapping tones that seemed to vibrate through his skull. Alex didn't stop. He couldn't. He pushed forward, weaving between the figures, their hands grasping at him with elongated fingers. Some of them melted back into the road as he passed, while others turned to watch him with that same wide, unnatural smile. The road ahead twisted, spiraling upward like a corkscrew. Gravity seemed to shift, pulling him toward the incline. He stumbled, clawing at the asphalt to keep his footing as the world bent around him. At the top of the spiral, a doorway loomed. It was massive and ancient-looking, carved from black stone and pulsating with the same eerie hum that filled the air. Alex hesitated, but the figures were closing in. Their distorted forms moved faster now, their smiles stretching wider. With no other choice, he threw himself through the doorway. The hum stopped. Silence enveloped him as he tumbled into darkness. For a moment, he thought he had fallen into the void, but then his feet found solid ground. The world around him flickered to life, dim and hazy. He was standing in a vast, empty plain, the horizon stretching endlessly in every direction. The sky above was a sickly yellow, devoid of stars or clouds. He turned to look back at the doorway, but it was gone. Instead, he saw a figure. It was standing in the distance, far too still, far too quiet. It didn't move, but Alex knew it was watching him. The chanting began again, faint and distant, as the figure took its first step forward. Alex felt the dry, brittle ground shift beneath his feet as he tried to step back. The figure in the distance wasn't just approaching, it was growing. With every step, its form stretched unnaturally, as if the landscape itself were warping to accommodate it. The chanting grew louder, coming from no discernible direction, vibrating in his chest and skull. Alex clutched at his temples, trying to block out the sound, but it only seemed to grow sharper, more invasive. The figure stopped. It was closer now, impossibly tall, its body an amalgamation of shifting, liquid-like shadows. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a smooth, featureless void that seemed to drink in the sickly light around it. "Why?" Alex whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the chant. The figure tilted what might have been its head. The chanting stopped, plunging the world into a deafening silence. Then, a voice, a low, guttural sound that resonated through the air. "Why do you run?" Alex's knees buckled, the sheer weight of the voice pressing down on him. It wasn't a question. It was a command, pulling at the very fabric of his mind, demanding an answer he didn't have. He tried to speak, but his throat tightened, words dying before they could form. The figure began to move again, this time not walking but gliding across the ground, leaving a trail of darkness in its wake. Desperate, Alex turned and ran. The ground seemed to resist him, his feet sinking slightly with every step. He could feel the figure behind him, its presence heavy and suffocating, like a storm cloud ready to break. Ahead, the landscape shifted. What had been a barren plain now sprouted twisted, jagged structures, monoliths of black stone, etched with symbols that pulsed faintly. They rose like teeth from the earth, forming a labyrinth that seemed to rearrange itself as he moved. He darted between the monoliths, the symbols glowing brighter as he passed. The chanting returned, more urgent, more chaotic, the words blending into an incomprehensible cacophony. The air grew colder, each breath stabbing at his lungs like icy needles. The figure's voice returned, louder now, echoing through the labyrinth. "There is no escape." Alex stumbled, his shoulder slamming into one of the monoliths. Pain shot through him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The labyrinth began to close in, the monoliths shifting closer together, their jagged edges scraping against one another. Alex squeezed through a narrowing gap, the rough stone tearing at his clothes and skin. Finally, he emerged into an open space, a circular clearing surrounded by the towering monoliths. In the center stood a pedestal, its surface glowing with a soft, blue light. On it rested a single object, a key, ancient and ornate, its design both intricate and incomprehensible. Alex hesitated, the chanting rising to a fever pitch. The figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, its form now larger than ever, its void-like face fixed on him. "Take it," the voice boomed, though whether it came from the figure or the chanting itself, Alex couldn't tell. His hand trembled as he reached for the key. The air around it felt alive, buzzing with an energy that made his skin crawl. The moment his fingers touched the key, the world around him shattered. The chanting stopped. The figure vanished. Alex found himself back in his car, parked on the side of a desolate road. The GPS screen blinked faintly, its distorted map slowly returning to normal. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, the key now clutched tightly in his other hand. A voice crackled through the car's speakers, faint but unmistakable. "You chose poorly." The engine roared to life on its own, and the car began to move. Not forward, not backward, but into something else entirely. A darkness that swallowed the world whole. The key in his hand grew colder, heavier, as the chanting returned, louder than ever. The car jerked forward, its tires screeching against the road as if the very surface was alive, unwilling to let him pass. Alex slammed his foot on the brake, but the pedal felt as though it had no power. The car continued to lurch forward, dragged by an invisible force. Through the windshield, the landscape had changed. The desolate stretch of road, the barren horizon, had disappeared. Instead, all that Alex could see was an expanse of endless, gray mist. The sky above had turned an oppressive shade of purple, and the trees, what remained of them, twisted like broken fingers reaching up to a sky that seemed to consume everything. His breathing became shallow, heart hammering in his chest. The key in his hand seemed to pulse, its cold surface growing colder, slick with an unknown substance that stained his palm. He tried to throw it, to rid himself of it, but his hand wouldn't let go. It was as though the key had become part of him, rooted deep inside his skin. "You should not have taken it," the voice boomed once more. It was no longer crackling through the speakers, but coming from within the car, surrounding him like a heavy fog. Alex's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, someone, looming behind him. But the mirror reflected nothing but darkness. He glanced back to the road ahead, and that's when he saw it. A figure, or what should have been a figure, emerging from the fog. It was impossible to focus on. Every time Alex tried to look at it directly, his vision would blur. But he could feel it watching him. It wasn't a presence. It was an invader, an anomaly that shouldn't exist in this world. Its form moved, not by walking, but by rippling through the air as if it were pulling the very fabric of reality with it. With a sudden, sharp jolt, the car surged forward, its headlights flickering wildly as if the vehicle itself were struggling to maintain its form. The fog thickened, and the mist poured in through every crack and seam of the car. Alex could feel it, not just physically but in his thoughts. It was invasive, corrupting his very consciousness, pulling his mind apart, making him forget himself, making him become a part of it. Suddenly, the car stopped. The sound of the engine died, leaving only the eerie silence that seemed to smother everything. Alex gripped the steering wheel harder, feeling the sweat begin to bead on his forehead. He looked at the key again, and it was as if the markings had shifted, as if the strange symbols had come to life under his gaze. Then, the voice returned. It was soft, almost a whisper, but it felt louder than any shout. "There is no road left for you, Alex. You've come too far." He slammed his fist against the dashboard, but no sound came from the car. His body felt detached, as if it weren't his anymore. The more he tried to control his movements, the more they slipped away from him. He turned to look out the window. The road, if it was even a road, had been replaced by what could only be described as nothingness, a vast expanse of black and gray that seemed to stretch forever. The key had warmed in his hand, warmed in an unnatural way. It felt like it was alive, like it was no longer just an object, but a part of the void, of whatever force had drawn him into this place. A figure, a true one this time, emerged from the fog beside the car. Not an abstract, shifting presence, but a woman. Her face was pale, eyes hollow and dark, and her mouth curved into a sadistic smile. She stepped closer to the window, her hand pressing against the glass. Alex tried to move, to scream, but he was paralyzed, unable to do anything but stare into her eyes. "You know what must be done," she murmured, her voice a sound that seemed to echo not just in the car but inside his skull, making his teeth ache. The key vibrated violently in his hand, the symbols now flashing, twisting in a desperate attempt to form coherent shapes, but the patterns made no sense. The voice grew louder. "No escape, Alex. You've taken what you shouldn't have. Now you must stay. You're already one of us." Alex tried to shout, to tear at the air in frustration, but as he opened his mouth, he felt something foreign slip inside him. It was a cold, slithering sensation that crawled under his skin, filling his body with a numbness that went deeper than his bones. His pulse slowed, his heart sinking. The woman smiled again, her face turning into something unrecognizable. The soft lines became sharp, grotesque, her mouth stretching impossibly wide as she spoke again. "This is your road now. This is your eternity." Alex's last thought was a question, a desperate, futile cry for some kind of sense. Why? Why me? But there was no answer, only silence. The car was gone, the fog engulfing him, the key warm in his palm, and the road, if it could still be called a road, disappearing beneath him. His mind unraveled as the world blurred, no longer existing in any form he could understand. And then, the road, the fog, the woman, the car, they were gone. The silence that followed was oppressive, a thick, suffocating air that seemed to weigh down on Alex's chest, making it difficult to breathe. It was as if the world around him had vanished, leaving him alone in a void, suspended in time and space. But as his senses slowly began to return, a soft sound reached his ears, a distant, rhythmic thumping. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer, as though something was drawing near. Alex's head snapped to the side, his eyes searching for the source of the noise, but the void around him was still too thick, too impenetrable to see anything clearly. He felt a strange pull, as if the very air was guiding him toward the sound. He hesitated. The instinct to flee was strong, but he felt a bizarre compulsion to move forward, to seek the source of the noise. His legs, unbidden, began to carry him, each step feeling heavier than the last. The ground beneath him was uneven, soft and shifting, as though it weren't solid at all but rather a strange, formless substance. The thumping grew louder, now accompanied by a low, guttural hum, like a whispering wind, only it wasn't wind. It was something else, something that made his skin crawl. Then, ahead of him, the fog parted slightly, revealing a shadow in the distance. It was large, too large to be a person, but its outline was blurred, indistinct. The shape seemed to shift in and out of focus, as though it was constantly in flux, not quite solid. Alex felt his heart race. The overwhelming urge to turn back surged within him, but his legs wouldn't obey. The strange hum grew louder, vibrating through the air, and the shadowy figure seemed to move, slowly at first, then faster, as though it was aware of his presence, and now it was coming for him. He stumbled backward, his breath shallow, but no matter how much he tried to move, his feet were rooted to the ground, as though the earth itself had claimed him. The figure was closer now, its shape becoming clearer. It wasn't human. The more Alex tried to comprehend what he was seeing, the more it eluded him. His body rippled like water, shifting in and out of reality. Long, jagged limbs stretched toward him, fingers that looked more like elongated claws than anything human. The face, if it could even be called a face, was a mass of shifting shadows, a patchwork of distorted features that seemed to blur and meld into one another. It was alive in a way that defied all logic, and the closer it came, the more Alex could feel his own mind unraveling. The sound of its movement, the rhythmic thumping, was no longer just a noise. It was a force, a presence, pressing against him from all sides, filling his thoughts, pushing into the cracks of his sanity. "Help me," Alex gasped, but the words felt foreign in his mouth. His tongue felt thick, sluggish, as though it was no longer his own. He reached out, his hand trembling, desperate to make contact with something, anything. But the moment his fingers brushed against the air, they passed through it like it was smoke. The figure stopped in front of him. The air around it crackled, a low hum vibrating through the ground. Alex felt the presence of something ancient and powerful, a being that had existed long before him and would endure long after. It was impossible to tell whether it was alive or not, or whether it even cared about him. Then it spoke. His voice wasn't words, not exactly. It was a sensation, a feeling that scraped against his very essence, burrowing deep inside his mind. It was both too loud and too quiet at the same time, and Alex could barely comprehend it. It was a message, but one that made no sense. Endings are inevitable, it said, though the sound wasn't truly a sound. It was a thought, a jarring intrusion into his mind. Beginnings are a lie. The words hung in the air, the space around him growing colder, darker. The figure moved closer, its arms outstretched, and Alex tried to scream, but the sound never left his throat. It was as if his body was no longer his thoughts no longer his, and every part of him was being absorbed, consumed by the entity before him. Suddenly, the sensation stopped. The world held still for a moment, and in that brief instant, Alex felt something that could only be described as peace. The absence of fear, the absence of time. But it was fleeting. The peace shattered as quickly as it had come, replaced by a torrent of confusion, dread, and pain. The figure's face twisted in a way that wasn't quite human, and its voice rang out again, louder this time, filling his skull, reverberating inside his chest. Your road has no end, Alex. You are already lost. A sharp, searing pain shot through his chest, and for a moment, everything went black. Alex's vision flickered as he regained consciousness. His body felt heavy, like he was sinking into the ground, unable to escape. He tried to move, but his limbs felt as if they had been shackled by an invisible force. The darkness was overwhelming, but not quite complete. There was something about the air, a faint shimmer, like the world around him was alive and watching. The pain in his chest was still there, gnawing at him, a constant reminder that he was not free. He could feel the weight of something pressing against him, but there was no sight of the figure anymore. It was as though it had dissolved into the air, leaving behind only the lingering sensation of its presence. His breathing was shallow, each inhalation harder than the last. Panic began to claw at him, the fear of being trapped, of never escaping, tightening around his chest. His thoughts spun in circles, a disjointed mix of memories and disorienting confusion. What was happening? Was he still dreaming? Was this the end? He tried to focus, to make sense of his surroundings, but there was nothing, just the endless, suffocating blackness. His eyes darted around, seeking anything that could give him a clue, a sense of direction, but all he saw was the void. It felt as though time had stopped, and the world itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, a noise pierced the silence, a soft, whispering sound, barely audible, but it was there. It was as if something was moving in the distance, skittering across the ground. The noise was erratic, like the patter of small feet, but it was too irregular, too disjointed to be anything natural. Alex's heart raced as he strained to listen, his ears desperate for some indication of what was happening. The skittering grew louder, closer, and the air around him seemed to ripple with the sound. It was impossible to place, to make sense of, and yet it felt unmistakably wrong. He wanted to call out, but his voice failed him. His throat felt dry, constricted. His body was paralyzed, trapped in this inescapable nightmare. The sensation of being watched was growing stronger. It was like something, or someone, was just out of his reach, circling him, waiting for the right moment. Then the skittering stopped. There was only silence again, an oppressive stillness that made his heart pound in his ears. And then, with terrifying slowness, something new began to emerge from the blackness. It was a presence, something that shifted in and out of perception, like a dark cloud gathering in the distance. The very air around him seemed to thicken, pressing down on him with an unbearable weight. He heard breathing slow, ragged, like the exhale of a dying animal. It was coming from all around him, not from one direction, but from everywhere. His pulse quickened, and his body screamed to move, to run, but he couldn't. He was frozen, his limbs unresponsive. The breathing grew louder, more labored, and the darkness around him seemed to contract, closing in with suffocating speed. He could feel the temperature drop, a cold that seeped deep into his bones, an unnatural chill that didn't belong in the air. His skin prickled, as if the very touch of the cold was making his flesh crawl. And then, just when he thought it couldn't get worse, a voice. It wasn't the figure's voice, but something else, something more distant, more ancient, and it whispered in a language Alex couldn't understand. The words felt like they were vibrating inside his skull, like something foreign was clawing at the edges of his mind. The whispering grew louder, the words becoming clearer, though they were still incomprehensible. And as they did, Alex felt a sudden pressure, a feeling of being pulled in all directions, as if the fabric of reality itself was tearing apart. Something was coming. Something was watching him, waiting for him to lose his mind. He could feel his grip on reality slipping, the edges of his perception fraying. The darkness was closing in, and with it came the suffocating feeling of being consumed, of being drawn into something far older, far more powerful than anything he could comprehend. The last thought that crossed his mind before the world seemed to swallow him whole was a simple, horrifying realization. This was never going to end. It was just past dusk when Martin's headlights first caught the silhouette. He had been driving for hours, winding his way through the back roads, trying to make it home before night completely swallowed the world. Route 47 was quiet, as it always was. The only sounds were the hum of his engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. The air outside was thick with the scent of wet earth from a recent rainstorm. The trees on either side of the road stood tall and silent, their outlines barely visible in the growing darkness. Martin had taken this route 100 times before, never expecting anything out of the ordinary. But tonight, something felt off. He couldn't place it, but the uneasy sensation gnawed at him. Maybe it was the rain, or the way the clouds hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. Or maybe it was just the fatigue settling into his bones, pushing him closer to the edge of alertness. Either way, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. And then he saw it, a deer. It stood at the side of the road, motionless, its head turned towards him. Its coat was sleek and dark, blending in with the shadows of the trees. The animal didn't move as his car approached, but its gaze, its eyes, seemed to follow him. The more Martin looked, the more uncomfortable he felt. There was something unnatural about the way it stood there. It was too still, too perfect in the darkness. He tapped the brakes, instinctively slowing down, though there was plenty of space to pass. He didn't want to risk hitting it, of course, but there was something more to it than that. The deer's presence felt like a warning, an omen of something to come. As he neared, the deer's head shifted slightly. It moved as though considering something, as if it had been waiting for him to arrive. And then, without any warning, it stepped into the road. Martin slammed on the brakes, his tires screeching against the wet asphalt. His heart pounded in his chest as the deer froze in front of him, blocking the entire lane. It was just standing there, unmoving, like it was daring him to come closer. He could see the animal's eyes now, wide and reflecting the headlights, the pupils dilated unnaturally. It didn't look like any deer he'd ever seen before. His gaze wasn't just calm. It was almost calculating. Something about it felt wrong. "Come on, get out of the way," Martin muttered to himself, his voice low and nervous. He honked the horn, hoping to startle the creature into moving, but the deer didn't flinch. It just stood there, its body rigid and unwavering. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Martin wasn't sure what was worse, the silence of the moment or the way the deer stared at him, unblinking. He considered backing up, but the road behind him was narrow, and there was nowhere to turn around. The thought of turning his back on the creature didn't sit well with him, either. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the deer moved. Slowly, deliberately, it took a few steps backward, but it didn't leave the road. Instead, it turned its head to the side, its gaze now fixed on something deeper in the trees. Its tail flicked once, then twice, and with that, it stepped aside, just enough for Martin to drive past. He didn't hesitate. He pressed the accelerator, eager to put some distance between himself and the unnerving encounter. But as he passed the deer, something in the woods caught his eye. A shape, a shadow, hidden just beyond the trees. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. For a brief moment, Martin swore he saw something moving in the woods. Something tall, much taller than any man, but too large to be an animal. It was only for an instant, and by the time he looked again, it was gone. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. The rain was coming harder now, the windshield wipers working overtime to keep the glass clear. The road ahead felt longer somehow, the darkness pressing in on him. He needed to get home. Minutes passed. Then another curve in the road appeared, and Martin's heart skipped a beat. There, on the side of the road, was the deer once again. It was standing exactly where it had been before, staring at him with those same unsettling eyes. But this time it wasn't alone. Behind it, something moved, just out of the corner of his eye. Another shape, tall and shadowed. Martin's foot slammed on the brake again, the car screeching as it skidded to a stop. His breath caught in his throat as he tried to focus on what he was seeing. There, just past the deer, was a figure, tall, humanoid, but distorted in a way that didn't make sense. Its body was long, too long, and it seemed to bend in unnatural angles. Its limbs were too thin, almost skeletal, and its head was misshapen, a twisted mockery of a human face. Martin couldn't tear his eyes away, even as his mind screamed at him to drive, to get away. The deer didn't move. It stood perfectly still, like it was waiting for something. Then the figure took a step forward, moving with a fluid grace that shouldn't have been possible for something that large. Martin's hands were shaking as he tried to start the engine, but the car wouldn't respond. The battery was dead. The figure took another step, and another. It was getting closer now, its long limbs reaching toward the car. The deer stood as still as ever, its eyes glowing faintly in the headlights. Martin knew he wasn't going to escape. The air inside the car grew thick, as if the world outside was pressing in, suffocating him. Martin's heartbeat thundered in his ears, but it was drowned out by a deep, low hum, something that seemed to emanate from the figure, a noise not of this world. His hands fumbled for the door handle, but his body refused to move, paralyzed with fear. He could only stare as the figure inched closer, its shape distorting unnaturally with each movement. The deer, once a mere observer, now shifted slightly, its head tilted as though acknowledging the figure's approach. It was no longer the calm, still animal it had once been. Its eyes, now glowing brighter, reflected something darker, something that shouldn't have been seen in the wilds of the world. Martin's mind screamed to run, to do anything, but his body refused to obey. His breathing came in shallow gasps as the figure grew closer, its twisted limbs scraping against the earth like the sound of old wood cracking. The lights of his car flickered. For a moment, they flashed wildly, illuminating the figure in terrifying detail. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were hollow voids of blackness with no reflection, no glint of life. Its skin was mottled and stretched, the texture almost translucent, revealing dark veins snaking beneath. And its face, though it resembled a grotesque human mask, seemed to shift and change, like it was made of 1,000 faces, none of them truly recognizable. A soft, unsettling whisper, like the rustling of leaves, filled the car. Martin didn't understand the words, but they felt like they were meant for him. They pressed against his mind, twisting it into shapes that didn't make sense. Suddenly, the car's engine sputtered to life, the engine roaring as if awakened by something ancient, something unseen. Martin slammed his foot down on the accelerator. The tires spun, screeching against the wet asphalt as he jerked the car forward, trying to escape. But it didn't matter how fast he drove, the figure didn't fade into the distance. Behind him, the deer still stood, its silhouette a dark shadow in the rearview mirror. And the figure, he could see it now, even as he sped away, even through the fog and rain, was still there. It was moving with impossible speed, keeping pace with him, as if it were right at his back, its twisted limbs matching every turn. Martin's breath quickened, panic starting to claw at him. The road ahead, once so familiar, now felt like a never-ending stretch of terror. He looked left, right, trying to find a turnoff, an escape. But everything was the same. Trees, darkness, rain. The figure had swallowed the road behind him, and he could feel its presence getting closer with every passing second. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack, a sound like the snapping of bones. He didn't know where it came from, but his hands tightened around the steering wheel. He looked up, realizing with horror that the road ahead was changing. The asphalt, once smooth and well-maintained, was now cracked, torn in places, as though something had ripped through it. The trees around him seemed to warp, growing taller and leaning in at unnatural angles. The world itself was shifting, distorting. The deer had disappeared. The figure was still behind him, too close now. Martin could feel it, could feel the cold, oppressive weight of its presence pushing against him, pressing against his very soul. He could hear the whispers again, clearer now, though they were still indecipherable. They weren't words anymore. They were thoughts, fragments of things that should never have been known. A flash of movement caught his eye. For a brief moment, he thought he saw something. A glimpse of a shape in the trees beside him, something tall and dark. But he couldn't focus. He couldn't allow himself to look away from the road. His heart was racing, his vision swimming with terror. Another crack. This time, it came from the front of the car. He slammed on the brakes, but the tires locked. The world outside blurred as the car skidded, the sound of metal scraping against stone ringing in his ears. The car came to a halt, just inches from the edge of the road. In the headlights, the twisted shape of the figure emerged. It was standing right in front of him, its face now inches away from the windshield, its hollow eyes staring into his soul. Its mouth, if it could even be called a mouth, opened slightly, and the words, those terrible, incomprehensible whispers, grew louder, more insistent. Martin couldn't breathe. He couldn't scream. The figure's face, now grotesque and misshapen, seemed to melt in front of him, the features shifting like wax under a flame. It leaned closer, its breath foul and hot against the glass, and he could feel it, pulling at the very core of his being. It was close now, too close, and then, without warning, the figure withdrew. The headlights flickered one last time, and the car jerked forward, as if pushed by some unseen force. The world around him spun in chaos, trees warping into shadows, the ground breaking apart. And in that instant, the figure was gone. The road, once cracked and torn, was smooth again. The air was still, the rain slowing to a drizzle. The headlights illuminated the quiet, empty road. The deer was gone, and Martin, he was alone. The silence around Martin was suffocating, a heavy, oppressive stillness that seemed to weigh on him from all sides. The only sound now was the faint dripping of rain from the trees above, but even that felt distant, like it was happening in another world. He sat frozen in the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles ached. His breathing came in shallow gasps, his heart hammering in his chest as he struggled to make sense of what had just happened. The world outside the car seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Waiting for what? Martin didn't know. All he knew was that something had changed. The air felt wrong now, thick with an unseen tension. He glanced around, half expecting to see the figure again, but there was nothing. Just the road, stretching out in front of him, empty and calm. For a moment, he considered just driving away, getting back on the road and leaving whatever nightmare he had just experienced behind. But something, an instinct perhaps, kept him from moving. He couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, just beyond the edges of his sight, waiting for him to make a mistake. And worse, the sense that it had not truly left. Martin hesitated, then slowly reached for the door handle. His body screamed at him to stay inside, but his mind was louder. He needed to check, needed to know if what he had seen was real. With a deep breath, he opened the door, the cold night air rushing in. His feet hit the ground with a soft thud, and he stood, his legs weak beneath him. The world felt off-kilter, as though the ground itself was subtly shifting. The trees around him swayed unnaturally, their branches bending in odd directions. The road, which had seemed so familiar before, now looked distorted, as though it was part of a dream or a nightmare. Martin's head spun with the realization that the landscape around him no longer made sense. The horizon had no end. The trees were too tall, their shadows too long. The night sky seemed too dark, too oppressive. He was no longer sure where the road was leading, or if it had ever been real. And then he heard it, a low, guttural noise, coming from the woods on his left. It was like the sound of something large dragging itself through the underbrush, something moving with unnatural force. His breath caught in his throat, and he instinctively took a step back toward the car. His mind screamed for him to get back inside, to lock the doors and drive away, but his body wouldn't cooperate. He stood frozen, listening, the air thick with dread. The sound grew louder, closer. There was no mistaking it now. Something was moving in the trees. Something huge, something deliberate. Martin's eyes darted around, but the darkness made it impossible to see anything clearly. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as the air grew colder. He felt the weight of something watching him, waiting. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The forest fell quiet again, but the silence felt even more suffocating than before. Martin's heart was racing now, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He didn't know what to do. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet felt glued to the ground. He glanced at the car, but the headlights were still on, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. Suddenly, a sharp crack sounded from behind him. The noise was so loud it made him jump, his heart skipping a beat. He spun around, eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sounds, just the stillness of the dark forest. Then he saw it. A shape, no, something, standing just at the edge of the road. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its form seemed to shimmer in the dim light from the car. It was hard to make out any details, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It was too tall, too lanky, too wrong. The way it stood there, unmoving, was enough to make Martin's blood run cold. The shape didn't move. It didn't make a sound, but Martin knew it was watching him, its gaze like a physical weight pressing down on him. He felt it in his bones. He could feel its presence, just beyond his line of sight, lurking in the darkness. His breath hitched as a cold gust of wind blew through the trees, rustling the leaves around him. The figure remained motionless, but something about it felt alive, watching, waiting for the right moment to move. Martin's heart pounded louder in his chest, each beat seeming to echo through the stillness of the night. Every instinct he had screamed at him to run, to get away, but his body wouldn't respond. He was trapped in place, frozen in fear, unable to tear his eyes away from the shape. Suddenly, it moved. The motion was impossibly fast, blurring with speed as it closed the distance between them in an instant. Martin barely had time to react before the thing was right in front of him, standing so close that he could feel its presence like a physical weight. The air grew colder still, and for the briefest of moments, their gazes locked. The figure's face was indistinguishable in the shadows, but Martin could feel the hatred radiating from it, thick and palpable. It was a thing that should not exist in the world, something born from nightmares, a creature beyond comprehension. And just like that, it was gone. The world around Martin snapped back to normal, the figure vanishing into the night like smoke, leaving only a lingering sense of dread. The trees were still, the wind had stopped, and the road was quiet again. But Martin knew that whatever he had just experienced wasn't over. The figure had gone, yes, but it had not left. And it would be back. It always would. The question was, when? Martin stood still, his breath ragged, his heart hammering in his chest. The world around him seemed too quiet now, too still, as though the very air had been sucked out of the night. His mind screamed at him to run, to get in the car and leave this place, but his body refused to move. Every part of him was locked in place, unable to process what had just happened. He glanced over his shoulder toward the car, the headlights still shining brightly into the darkness. The road was empty, the trees swaying gently in the wind, their leaves rustling in the distance. It almost seemed like everything was normal again, like the thing that had just been standing in front of him had been some twisted figment of his imagination. But Martin knew better than to trust his eyes now. The unease gnawed at him from the inside out. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something watching him from the shadows. He felt it in the pit of his stomach, a cold, nauseating sense of dread that clung to him like a second skin. His mind raced, replaying the encounter over and over. That shape so tall, so unnatural, and the way it had moved so impossibly fast, as if it had bent the very laws of nature. It had been like a shadow, but it had been real, and it had been aware. He wasn't imagining it. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just some trick of the mind. It was something real, something that lived in the dark corners of the world. He couldn't stay here, not like this. Slowly, his legs began to move, and he turned back toward the car. The rain had started to fall heavier now, drumming against the roof of the car in a rhythmic patter, as if to remind him of the world he was still connected to. He reached for the door handle with trembling fingers, but just as his hand brushed against it, a noise stopped him dead in his tracks. A sound, faint at first, barely audible over the rain, but unmistakable. It was a scraping noise, like something dragging across the ground. Something heavy, something slow. It was coming from behind him. Martin's breath hitched, his blood turning to ice. He didn't dare turn around. He didn't want to see whatever it was, didn't want to acknowledge the terror creeping up his spine. But the sound was getting closer, dragging closer, like something was stalking him from the woods. A low, guttural sound, as though something was struggling to move. His legs finally responded to the instinct to flee. He threw open the door and jumped into the driver's seat, slamming it shut behind him. His hands shook as he fumbled for the keys in his pocket, his mind racing. He could hear the scraping now, unmistakable and unrelenting, as though whatever it was right behind the car. He turned the ignition, the engine sputtering to life, and slammed his foot down on the gas. The car lurched forward, tires spinning on the wet road. Martin's breath came in ragged bursts as he sped down the road, glancing nervously in the rearview mirror. The world behind him was nothing but rain and shadows, but the scraping noise had stopped. It was almost as if the thing had let him go, as if it was waiting for something. He couldn't bring himself to look back. His foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, pushing the car faster as the trees blurred past. He needed to get away. He didn't know where the road was taking him anymore. He just needed to get away from this place, from whatever had been lurking in the woods. The rain fell in sheets now, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour. The headlights barely illuminated the road ahead of him, but it didn't matter. He couldn't focus on the road anymore. His mind kept drifting back to the woods, to that thing, to the sound that had followed him. It was still out there somewhere, watching, waiting. But as Martin drove, something in the distance caught his attention. A shape, something just barely visible through the veil of rain. It was standing at the edge of the road, right where the trees thinned out, right where the curve of the road led into a narrow, dark tunnel. His heart skipped a beat. It was a deer, a large, dark shape, standing still in the middle of the road. Its body was unnaturally still, too still. The rain glistened on its coat, but there was something wrong about it. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were empty black voids, hollow and unblinking, staring straight into Martin's. For a brief moment, Martin wondered if he was hallucinating. But as he got closer, he saw that the deer didn't move. It didn't even flinch as the car barreled toward it. The headlights illuminated its dark, empty gaze, and Martin slammed his foot on the brakes. The car skidded, tires screeching as the vehicle jerked to a halt just inches from the deer. Martin's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. He could hear the steady drip of rain on the roof, the only sound breaking the heavy silence that had enveloped the car. And then, to his horror, the deer began to move. Not in the way a deer should, not with the graceful, fluid motion of an animal running or jumping. No, the deer's movements were jerky, unnatural, as though it were struggling to keep itself upright. Its head tilted to the side, and it began to slowly walk toward the car, its hooves scraping against the wet pavement with that same terrible dragging noise he had heard earlier. Martin's breath caught in his throat, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. The deer didn't blink, didn't look away. Its black eyes were locked on him, unwavering, as it drew closer. The air in the car seemed to grow colder. The rain didn't seem to touch the windshield anymore. All that mattered, all that existed in that moment, was the deer and its hollow gaze. He could feel the panic rising in his chest as the thing drew closer. Every instinct in his body told him to drive away, to escape this nightmare. But the car wouldn't move. The engine was still running, but the car remained motionless. It was as if the deer had stopped him, trapped him in place. Martin's breathing became shallow as the creature reached the front of the car. Its head tilted farther to one side, and it leaned in close to the windshield. The smell of wet earth and decay filled the air, nauseating and thick. And then the deer spoke. "You're mine now." The words were so low, so guttural, that Martin almost didn't believe his own ears. But they echoed in his mind, louder than any sound he had ever heard. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly his fingers ached, but the world around him was already slipping away. Martin's pulse raced as he stared at the creature, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The words that had come from its mouth weren't natural. They weren't the words of an animal, and they weren't the words of anything human. It was as if the very air around him had thickened with a malevolent presence, suffocating him with its weight. The deer's black eyes never wavered. It stood just inches from the windshield, its breath fogging up the glass as it leaned closer. The low, guttural growl it emitted seemed to vibrate in his chest, reverberating like the sound of distant thunder. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, each second dragging on in agonizing slow motion. The only sound Martin could hear was his own shallow breathing and the deafening silence of the night around him. "You're mine now," the words echoed in his mind, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. He had to get out of there. He had to drive away to escape whatever this thing was. But his body didn't respond. His fingers were frozen on the steering wheel, his foot still pressed against the brake. The car paralyzed as if some invisible force had taken hold of it. He glanced back at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something else lurking behind him, something worse than the creature in front of him. But the road was empty. The rain blurred the view, and the darkness beyond the headlights swallowed everything in its grasp. The deer took another slow step forward, its hooves scraping against the pavement, dragging the horrible, dragging sound that seemed to rattle his bones. Martin's throat went dry as his eyes locked onto the creature's face, unable to look away. He couldn't tell if it was still a deer. No, not anymore. It was something else. Something dark, something ancient. The creature's mouth curled upward into a grotesque, twisted smile that sent a jolt of pure terror through his body. And then, as if responding to his terror, the car shook. Just a subtle tremor at first, but it quickly grew in intensity, rattling the windows and sending a wave of dread through Martin's entire being. The dashboard flickered, and the lights dimmed. Without thinking, Martin slammed his foot down on the accelerator. The car lurched forward, tires screeching as it shot away from the deer, but the world around him didn't change. The road blurred past, but something was wrong. The road, the trees, the rain, it all looked the same. The landscape was shifting, warping, but it was all the same. Endless, dark, and empty. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he glanced frantically around. The headlights barely cut through the darkness anymore. The rain seemed to have intensified, turning into a torrential downpour that obscured everything beyond the windshield. But then he saw it, a set of eyes, two glowing, black orbs staring back at him from the side of the road. A second deer. No, it wasn't a deer. It was something else. It stood motionless in the shadows, hidden just enough that he could see only the outline of its dark, twisted body. The eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and he could feel them watching him, waiting. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He drove faster. He had to get away. This wasn't real. None of it was real. He had to be dreaming, or he was hallucinating from the exhaustion, from the fear, from everything. He couldn't afford to look at it. He couldn't afford to stop. But as his gaze darted back to the road ahead, another figure appeared. The third, and another. They were scattered along the roadside, each with those same glowing eyes, staring at him with a hunger he couldn't even begin to fathom. The road was no longer just a road. It was a trap that he had driven into, and he couldn't escape. The car sputtered, its engine coughing and stalling. Panic surged through him, and he slammed his foot onto the gas pedal, but nothing happened. The car had stopped. The creatures in the shadows were closer now, surrounding him on all sides. He could see them better now, their forms shifting and contorting in ways that no living creature should be able to move. They were tall, impossibly tall, their limbs elongated, like twisted reflections of something that had once been alive. Their eyes were hollow and empty, yet full of a cold, predatory hunger. Their mouths parted in silent screams, their gaping jaws filled with rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. One of them stepped forward, its elongated fingers scraping across the side of the car. It didn't make a sound, but Martin could feel its presence pressing in on him. His pulse pounded in his ears, the fear choking him. "You're not leaving." The voice came from all around him, a chorus of low, rumbling growls and whispers that seemed to seep from the very walls of the car. The world outside the windows darkened, the shadows closing in. Martin pressed his hands against the wheel, desperate to escape, to do anything. But his body had gone numb. He couldn't move. The creatures were closer now, and their hollow eyes bore into him like 1,000 pinpricks of ice. He could feel the cold creeping into his bones. The rain pounded against the car, and in the thick darkness, something moved in the back seat. Martin's breath caught in his throat as the sound from the back seat grew louder. A soft scraping, almost like the sound of fingernails dragging across fabric. He couldn't turn around, couldn't bring himself to face whatever it was, yet he could feel its presence pressing in, inch by inch. His fingers trembled against the steering wheel as he glanced at the rearview mirror, half afraid to look. The empty reflection mocked him, offering no answers, only a deeper silence that clawed at his mind. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to move, but he was frozen, paralyzed by the uncertainty of what waited behind him. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. He was no longer alone. Martin's eyes darted around, searching for any escape, but the road stretched out in front of him, endless and unfamiliar. The creatures, those twisted beings with their glowing eyes, had closed in further, standing just inches away from the car. He could see their silhouettes shifting, their unnatural forms twitching with something far beyond human comprehension. Suddenly, the backseat door creaked open. Slowly, the metal scraping against metal seemed to echo through his skull, and his heart thundered in his chest. Don't look back. But it was no use. His body moved before he could stop it. He twisted his head, eyes wide in terror as he saw it. What was once a shadow, now fully formed. It was crouched in the back seat, hunched over, with those same black, soulless eyes staring directly at him. Its face, if it could even be called that, was pale, almost sickly, its skin stretched taut over bone. The mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth, sharp and glinting in the dim light. It wasn't human. It never had been. The car jolted again, this time not from the engine's failure, but from the force of something slamming into the vehicle's side. The sound of metal bending and screeching filled the cabin, and Martin felt the car shift sideways. His heart leapt into his throat as the pressure mounted, the weight of something immense pushing against the vehicle. The creature in the back seat hissed, a low, guttural sound that made Martin's skin crawl. It tilted its head slightly, as though inspecting him, its black eyes narrowing. "Leave, now," it whispered, its voice rasping, not quite human, not quite animal. The words sent a chill through his entire being, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Martin felt the overwhelming pull of terror, a primal urge to flee, to escape whatever this was. He yanked the gear shift into drive, slamming his foot down on the accelerator. The car lurched forward again, its wheels screeching against the wet pavement. But the pressure from the side didn't relent. The creatures, if that's what they were still there, pushing against him. He could feel the car being forced off the road, its tires struggling to find grip. The headlights flickered erratically as if the world itself was turning against him. Rain lashed at the windshield in sheets, blurring the road ahead until he couldn't see anything at all. The air was thick with an unnatural fog, the kind that made the world seem smaller, more suffocating. He couldn't stop. He couldn't give in. But the more he fought against the pull of the road, the stronger it seemed to grow. The creatures weren't just on the outside. They were inside his mind, scratching at the edges of his sanity. They had been following him, stalking him from the moment he had driven down this twisted path, and now they were inside, like a virus infecting his thoughts. The world around him started to warp. The trees on the side of the road began to twist and bend, their shapes shifting into grotesque forms, like unnatural faces stretching toward him. The rain intensified, hammering against the car like nails driven into wood. The darkness outside deepened, suffocating the world in a black void. Suddenly, the creature in the back seat lunged forward with inhuman speed, its claws scraping across the seat as it pressed closer. Martin's heart exploded in his chest as he slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt, the tires grinding to a stop as the creature's face came inches from his own, its putrid breath fogging up the glass. "You can't run forever," it whispered, its voice like a wet rasp against his ear. Martin's body went cold. There was no escaping, no way out. The road stretched endlessly, twisting and curling in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The creatures were everywhere, everywhere in the fog, in the trees, on the road, in his mind. The car shuddered again as something heavy crashed against the roof, followed by a deafening crack. The roof caved in slightly, the metal bending under the pressure. Panic surged through him as he realized he was no longer in control. Something clawed at the door, pulling at it, trying to get inside. The door handle snapped off with a sickening crack, and the metal groaned as if the car itself were screaming. Every instinct told him to run, but there was no place to run to, no place to hide. The creature's clawed hand slowly reached across the seat, its fingers curling toward him. Martin's breath was caught in his throat as he reached for the door handle, but his body was frozen in place. It was happening again. It was happening, and this time there was no escape. The creature's fingers brushed against Martin's shoulder, sending a sharp chill through his body. He could feel the heat of its touch seeping through his jacket, its grip tightening as if to pull him into the nightmare that awaited him outside. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a thunderous echo in his ears. He didn't know what to do, didn't know where to go, as the world around him collapsed into a blur of darkness and chaos. The creature's other hand emerged, clawing at the seat, its eyes glowing brighter now, burning with a hunger that seemed insatiable. Martin tried to push the door open, but it was locked. Panic set in, his breath coming in quick, ragged gasps. His hands trembled as they searched for the keys in his pocket, the metal digging into his skin. He didn't even hear the click of the ignition turning over until the engine roared back to life, the engine sputtering and coughing as it tried to power up. But before he could make any move to drive, the creature pressed its face against the window. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, the jagged teeth clattering against the glass, and its breath fogged up the surface. "You should have stayed away," it hissed. The words sent a wave of dread through Martin, but before he could react, the car lurched violently to the side again, and the world outside seemed to warp in ways that didn't make sense. The rain came down in sheets, but it wasn't water. It was dark, viscous, and thick, like tar falling from the sky. His wipers struggled against the sticky substance as it smeared across the glass, making it harder to see. The road, if it could still be called that, wasn't the same. It had become something else, twisting into an unrecognizable labyrinth that made no sense. The trees were bent and deformed, their trunks gnarled and clawed, like the hands of some forgotten god trying to reach into his world. Martin's hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white, and the car screamed down the road, tires sliding across the wet surface as he tried to control it. The fog rolled in thicker, smothering everything around him, and the darkness grew deeper, like a living thing trying to swallow him whole. In the rearview mirror, Martin saw movement. Something small, something creeping toward him. His eyes widened in horror as he caught a glimpse of it. A twisted, contorted version of what once was a deer. Its body was unnaturally long, its legs bent in ways that couldn't possibly be natural. Its face, no, its head, was a mess of broken, jagged bone and skin, hollowed eyes staring into the rearview mirror with a soul-shattering emptiness. It was following him. No, it was more than that. It was hunting him. "Turn around," the voice from the back seat whispered again, this time louder, more forceful. His eyes darted to the mirror. The creature was gone, but its reflection lingered. That twisted deer was there, its eyes gleaming in the mist like two burning embers. It had crossed the road. Somehow it had shifted, crossed from one side to the other impossibly fast, almost like it had never been bound by the laws of reality. "Turn around." The voice seemed to resonate through his head now, not just in his ears. It was everywhere. It was in the air, in the tires, in the rain falling in sheets. It was seeping into him, crawling under his skin. "Turn around." Martin's hands tightened on the wheel. His breath caught in his throat as the urge to look back intensified. His foot hovered over the brake. For a split second, he thought he could feel the grip of the creature's claws again, the pressure of it bearing down on him. The road stretched on endlessly, winding and curling. He couldn't turn back. He couldn't. The wiper blades scraped across the windshield as if fighting a battle against the tar-like rain. He glanced at the side mirror. The road was empty, but the fear gnawing at him, relentless, palpable, told him otherwise. A sudden crash of thunder split the air. Martin slammed on the brakes, the car jolting to a halt. There, in front of him, stood the deer. No, it wasn't a deer anymore. It was something else, something far worse. The creature's body seemed to melt and shift, elongating and twisting, bones cracking in ways they shouldn't have. Its grotesque form now much larger than it ever should have been. Its head, that twisted mockery of an animal's face, turned slowly toward him, its eyes gleaming with malice. The car stalled. The lights flickered. Everything in the world slowed, as if time had stopped just for this moment. The deer, no, whatever it had become, started to move toward him, its twisted legs dragging across the road, splintering the asphalt as it came closer. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice now something more ancient, something far older than he could understand. Martin's heart raced in his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His hands were slick with sweat, his body frozen in place. And then the world began to crumble. The ground beneath him cracked, the earth splitting open as the creature lunged forward, its twisted form now so close he could hear the rasp of its breath against the night air. The creature's presence felt like an oppressive force, its twisted body casting long shadows across the car as it crawled closer. Each movement was slow, deliberate, as if savoring the fear it was instilling in Martin. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and the once crisp sound of the rain hitting the car was now drowned by an unsettling silence, broken only by the faint scratching of its claws against the asphalt. Martin's heart thudded loudly in his chest, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't bring himself to move. His foot, seemingly of its own volition, pressed against the gas pedal. But the car didn't budge. The creature's head tilted, its grotesque eyes narrowing as it studied him. Time seemed to stretch indefinitely, each second feeling like an eternity as it inched closer, its body elongating unnaturally with every step. "You've come too far," it whispered again, the voice a hiss that resonated deep within Martin's mind. The words felt like poison, slipping into his thoughts, twisting them, manipulating them. Suddenly, the car lurched forward on its own, tires spinning as the creature closed the gap. The engine roared in protest, the headlights flickering erratically as they lit up the twisted form of the creature, its skin glistening in the dim light like wet leather. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the ground as it moved closer, filling the air with a sense of impending doom. Martin's fingers twitched on the wheel, trying to regain control, but his body felt like lead, his limbs frozen in place. The creature was mere feet away now. Its breath fogged up the windshield, and its clawed hand reached out, tapping against the glass as though testing its limits. The wipers continued to swipe frantically, the tar-like rain blurring his vision even further. He could barely make out the shape of the thing, but the eyes, they were the most terrifying part. There was something ancient and malevolent behind those hollow, black pits. They seemed to promise endless torment, a fate far worse than death. With a sudden burst of strength, Martin slammed his foot onto the gas pedal. The car shot forward, its tires screeching in protest, but it didn't matter. He had to get away. The car sped down the road, the engine roaring louder than before, but every turn, every curve, only seemed to make things worse. The road had warped once again. The trees that lined the sides were now distorted, twisted into grotesque shapes that reached out like monstrous hands. The road, once a clear path, now seemed to twist in impossible directions, narrowing and widening at random. The creature, however, wasn't far behind. Its movements were unnatural, as though it was both there and not there at the same time. One moment it was closing in on him from the left, and the next it appeared in the rearview mirror, its eyes locked onto his. The distance between them was closing, and no matter how fast he drove, it seemed to be matching his speed, relentless in its pursuit. The world outside the car was no longer a familiar road. It had turned into a nightmare, an endless expanse of dark, oppressive trees and twisted, distorted paths. The sky was an unnatural shade of black, swirling with storm clouds that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Panic surged through Martin's chest as he glanced at the gas gauge. It was nearing empty. He could see the glow of the red warning light flickering in the corner of his eye, a cruel reminder that time was running out. He couldn't outrun it forever. Desperation crept into his mind, and he knew that if he didn't find a way out soon, there would be no escape. The creature, though invisible to the naked eye at times, was still there, lurking just behind him, breathing heavily, waiting. It was relentless, its presence a constant weight on his shoulders. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the road ahead of him began to distort further, twisting in on itself until the asphalt became a writhing mass of tar and broken stone. The headlights flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows on the trees that seemed to move with a life of their own. The trees swayed in a rhythm, as if they were breathing. He slammed his foot on the brake, the car skidding as it tried to stop, but the road had turned into something impossible, a living thing that pulsed with an unnatural energy. The tires couldn't grip onto the shifting surface. He was spiraling, falling into the darkness, and there was no escape. Suddenly, everything around him went still. A deafening silence settled over the car. The engine sputtered and died, the lights flickering out completely, leaving Martin in total darkness. His breath quickened in the pitch black, the shadows around him seemingly growing thicker, pressing in. In the utter silence, the sound of breathing slow, ragged, and deep filled the car. It wasn't his breath. It wasn't his own. The air grew colder, the chill crawling down his spine. He could feel something in the darkness, something right behind him, waiting. The breath was so close now that it felt like a cold gust against his neck. His skin crawled, and his eyes flicked toward the rearview mirror again, but there was nothing there. Only the oppressive blackness. A soft, low growl echoed from behind him, sending a surge of terror through his body. It was then that he realized he had been wrong. It had never been about outrunning it. It was always about surviving the waiting. The growl intensified, vibrating the very core of Martin's being. It was a low, guttural sound, the kind that rattles your bones and makes your skin crawl. His heart thumped loudly in his chest, drowning out all other sound, as he tried to push open the door of the car. But his hands shook so violently he couldn't grip the handle. The cold breath on his neck was becoming unbearable now, like ice sinking into his flesh. A presence, darker than any shadow, pressed against him, and he knew. It was inside the car now. The darkness around him wasn't just the absence of light. It was an entity, something far older than human understanding, something that thrived on fear, on panic. Suddenly, the car jolted, shaking violently as though something enormous was scraping along the sides. The metal screamed in protest, the sound searing through the air like nails on a chalkboard. Martin's panic surged into overdrive. He had to get out. He had to survive. Desperate, he lunged for the handle again, this time succeeding. The door flew open, slamming into the side of the car as he scrambled out. The world outside the car was no better. The road had completely disappeared. He was standing on a cracked surface, blackened and charred, stretching endlessly into the horizon. The air was thick with fog, swirling with strange, faint whispers, his name, echoing from all directions. He tried to run, his legs unresponsive, as though they were bound by some invisible force. His feet stumbled over jagged stones, and the fog swallowed him whole. But the growl, that horrible, deep growl, was still there. It wasn't behind him anymore. It was all around him. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice hissed again, and this time it was unmistakably coming from the fog itself. It wrapped around his mind, his thoughts, pulling them apart as he tried to focus on anything other than the growing sense of dread. His lungs burned as he gasped for air, his eyes darting wildly around, searching for any sign of escape. And that's when he saw it, the eyes. They weren't glowing, but they burned like holes in the very fabric of reality. At first, just one pair, then another and another, dozens of them staring at him from the fog. They were not animal eyes, not human. They were eyes of something else, something ancient, something hungry. The presence was everywhere now. The ground beneath his feet trembled as the fog thickened, swirling violently around him. The temperature dropped, and the hairs on his neck stood straight up. He was no longer alone. He was surrounded by darkness, and it was waiting. With a final, defiant scream, Martin turned and ran, his legs barely moving, as though the very air itself was trying to slow him down. The whispers were louder now, echoing in his mind, drowning out all reason. The fog closed in faster, the dark eyes watching him, waiting for him to slip. And then, just as he thought he couldn't run any longer, the ground beneath him gave way. His body fell weightless for a moment, before crashing into something soft and cold. He tried to scream, but the air was gone, suffocated by an invisible force pressing down on him. His arms flailed, but the darkness closed in around him, pushing him deeper into a cold, empty void. The last thing he felt before everything went still, before his mind faded to nothing, was the chilling touch of something cold against his skin. The fog swallowed him whole, and the road was silent once again. The end. It was late into the night when Charlie first noticed the figure at the side of the road. He had been driving for hours, the truck's headlights cutting through the dark expanse of the lonely highway. The monotonous hum of the engine and the steady wheel of the truck made the miles slip by without much thought. He had seen this stretch of road 100 times, but something was off tonight. Something in the air that felt thick, as if the world itself was holding its breath. His eyelids began to grow heavy. Charlie rubbed his face, pushing away the creeping fatigue that had started to settle into his bones. He had only a few more miles to go before he could take a break. Then, through the corner of his eye, he saw it. A pale figure standing by the side of the road, barely visible in the dim glow of his headlights. He swerved, but not enough to make it dangerous. His first instinct was to pull over and offer help. It wasn't uncommon to see stranded motorists or hitchhikers on this stretch. As he slowed down, the truck's engine giving a low growl as it dropped speed, Charlie watched the figure more closely. It was a woman. She was standing at the edge of the road, dressed in a white gown, the kind that looked old-fashioned and out of place in this day and age. Her hair was long and tangled, a dark mass that hung loosely around her shoulders. Her posture was unnaturally still, like she hadn't moved an inch since Charlie had first spotted her. And, despite the cold wind that had begun to pick up, there was no movement in her gown, no sign that she was even alive. Charlie's eyes narrowed, curiosity getting the better of him. He leaned over to the passenger seat, grabbed his phone, and checked the time. 3:12 a.m. He frowned, wondering what someone would be doing out here at this hour. Still, he thought it wasn't his problem. He turned the wheel and prepared to drive on. That's when he heard the voice. "Help me." It wasn't loud, not even a shout, just a faint whisper that he could have easily ignored, except that it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was almost pleading. Without thinking, Charlie slowed the truck to a complete stop. The engine hummed quietly, the road ahead empty and cold. He shifted the gear stick into park and stared at the woman for a moment longer. Something about her presence was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Maybe it was the way the air felt heavier, thicker, the way his instincts screamed for him to drive away. But against his better judgment, he opened the truck door and stepped out into the night. As his boots hit the gravel of the roadside, the wind kicked up, brushing against his face. The woman hadn't moved. She still stood there, facing the road, her back to him. He called out to her. "Hey, you okay? Do you need help?" No response. Charlie hesitated, his gaze locked on the woman. He took a step forward, then another. Each step felt heavier, like the air was getting thicker, like the world around him was pressing down on him with each breath. The woman remained motionless, and as he got closer, he began to feel an unsettling chill in the air, a coldness that seeped into his bones, deeper than any normal wind could reach. "Hello!" His voice trembled slightly as he reached out a hand toward her. But before he could touch her, she turned. Her face was pale, almost ghostly white, with hollow eyes that were completely black. There was no iris, no white, just endless darkness where her eyes should have been. Her mouth twisted into a smile that wasn't warm, but thin and full of something dark, something predatory. Her lips barely moved as she spoke again. "You should leave." The words were not spoken in a voice of a living person. There was something wrong in them, an unnatural rasp that sent an ice-cold shiver through Charlie's entire body. Before he could react, the woman took a step forward. The air grew even colder, and her face twisted again into a grimace. Charlie stumbled back, but something tugged at his feet, as if the road itself was trying to drag him in. He yanked his foot free, adrenaline surging through him. He had to get back to the truck. "Help me," she whispered again, but this time the voice was distant, as though coming from a different place, a different time. Panic flooded his system, and Charlie sprinted back to the truck. His heart pounded in his chest as he jumped into the cab, slammed the door shut, and locked it. He didn't even think to check the mirrors. He just put the truck in gear and floored the accelerator. The tires screeched as the truck tore down the highway, the engine roaring to life. But as he glanced into the rearview mirror, he saw her. The woman was standing in the exact same spot, her black eyes staring directly at him, even as the truck sped away. Her lips barely moved as she whispered again, almost too quiet to hear, but clear enough for Charlie's racing mind to understand. "You can't escape." The words echoed in his ears, following him down the road, growing louder and louder until the sound of the tires on asphalt drowned them out completely. But even then, Charlie knew. He wasn't sure how, but he knew he wasn't alone anymore. Not for a long time. Charlie gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his eyes locked onto the dark road ahead. The sound of the engine seemed to fade in the background, overtaken by the pulsing thrum of fear coursing through his veins. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it a prank? He wondered. Had someone dressed up as a ghost to mess with truckers? But no, he couldn't shake the image of her face. Those black eyes, that chilling smile. The sense of dread had felt so raw, so real. It wasn't something he could easily dismiss as a joke. Still, his grip loosened on the wheel as he tried to calm himself down. The cold sweat on his back began to chill as the truck sped down the road, the lights cutting through the darkness. The highway stretched endlessly ahead of him, a winding serpent of asphalt, but his eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, almost against his will. He knew he shouldn't look, but his curiosity, and the nagging sensation that she was still there, pulled him back to it. He glanced. Nothing. The woman was gone, but the road ahead felt strangely empty. The trees on either side of the highway seemed to bend inward, their branches twisted, clawing at the air like skeletal fingers. The deeper he drove, the thicker the night seemed to grow. It wasn't just the absence of light that disturbed him, but the way everything felt like it was closing in. He should have been at the next town by now. Charlie tried to shake the sense of disorientation that had begun creeping into his thoughts. His mind was exhausted, foggy. Maybe he was just overtired, seeing things, imagining the worst. He had been driving for hours, after all. But the sound of the road, its deep, unsettling hum, made it hard for him to think straight. He pushed the gas pedal down harder, hoping to make it to the next rest stop before his thoughts could spiral any further. But then the lights flickered. At first, it was subtle, a soft dimming and flickering of the truck's headlights, but it grew. The beams began to pulse, like they were fighting to stay alive, their light swallowing the darkness around them, only to lose the battle with each passing second. Charlie cursed under his breath. He reached for the dashboard, but before he could touch anything, the lights went out completely. The world around him was swallowed by pitch-black darkness. He slammed his foot on the brake, jerking the truck to a stop. His heart thudded in his chest as the engine sputtered, then completely died. Dead silence. Charlie sat in the truck, frozen, staring out into the inky blackness. The kind of silence that felt too heavy, too thick with anticipation, like something unseen was holding its breath right alongside him. He reached for the ignition again, but the key wouldn't turn. The truck wasn't responding. His mind raced. The radio. He reached for the dial and twisted it, trying to hear anything, but all he got was static. Then a voice. Not the woman. A low, crackling whisper that seemed to reverberate through the truck's metal frame, sending a shiver down his spine. You shouldn't have stopped. Charlie froze. It was faint, but unmistakable. The voice was so close, like someone was sitting right next to him. But when he turned to look, the seat beside him was empty. He exhaled sharply, his pulse quickening. This wasn't just fear anymore. It was sheer panic. What the hell was happening? His eyes darted from one window to the next, trying to catch any movement, any sign of life. But there was nothing, just the darkened trees and the empty road stretching on for miles. Suddenly, the faintest of movements caught his eye, something at the edge of the trees. It was her, the woman in the white gown. She was standing at the far side of the road, staring at him. Only this time, there was no plea in her expression. Her face was vacant, almost emotionless. Her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The wind had picked up again, but her gown didn't flutter. It hung motionless, as though she were carved from stone. His breath caught in his throat as the air seemed to grow colder, more suffocating. And then, the unthinkable happened. The woman began to move. She glided toward the truck, her feet never touching the ground, her form growing larger with each passing second. Charlie's pulse hammered in his ears. The whispering voice grew louder, filling the cab of the truck until it drowned out everything else. His head was spinning. He had to leave, but his body refused to move. His hand shot to the door handle, but as he pulled it, the door didn't open. It was stuck, as if something or someone was holding it shut. Panic gripped him as he pushed harder, yanking with all his strength, but the door stayed sealed. You shouldn't have stopped. The voice hissed again, this time louder, more insistent, filling his mind with an unshakable terror. The woman was nearly at the truck now, her presence overwhelming the space around him. He could feel her eyes burning into him, cold and relentless. She was inches away, but he couldn't escape. He couldn't move. She reached out a hand, pale as death, and pressed it against the truck window. The touch sent an icy jolt of terror down his spine. He jerked away, eyes wide in fear, but it was already too late. The glass cracked, just a tiny fracture at first. Then a series of cracks spread across the window like spiderwebs, breaking the silence with a sharp, splitting sound. The temperature inside the cab plummeted, the cold seeping into his skin, freezing his very breath. Charlie could see the woman's face pressed against the glass now, her lips forming silent words that he couldn't hear, her black eyes staring straight into his soul. And then, with a sudden violent crash, the window shattered. Charlie screamed, but the air was sucked from his lungs, leaving him unable to make a sound. The woman's face, her haunting, blank stare, filled the truck, her cold breath fogging up the space between them. Everything froze. The silence was heavy in the cab of Charlie's truck. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, the only sound coming from the hum of the engine. Outside, the world was still. The trees that lined the highway were lifeless, shadows stretching unnaturally long, their gnarled branches reaching as if they were trying to pull him into the forest. Charlie's breath came in shallow gasps, the chill in the air sinking into his bones. He had to get out of here. He slammed his foot on the gas, but the truck didn't budge. The engine growled beneath him, but it didn't move forward. His heart pounded louder than the engine's growl, each beat sinking with the increasing sense of dread that gripped him. It felt like the road itself was alive, holding him in place, refusing to let him leave. Charlie gripped the wheel with both hands, his body tense. A deep feeling of unease washed over him, and he couldn't shake the sensation that he was being watched. The feeling, at first subtle, soon became overwhelming, as if eyes were boring into him from every corner. And then there it was, the woman, not outside the window but inside the cab. Charlie's breath hitched as he turned his head slowly, his eyes flicking toward the passenger seat. She was sitting there now, her presence undeniable, her ghostly figure frozen in the corner of his vision. Her face was pale, hollow, like a mask of someone who had long since forgotten what it meant to be alive. Her hair hung in wet, tangled clumps around her face, and her eyes, they were the worst part. Empty, black voids that seemed to draw in the light, sucking the warmth out of the air. Charlie tried to scream, but the sound caught in his throat. The coldness around him seemed to intensify, seeping through his skin, down into his bones, as if the very atmosphere had become an extension of her. Her eyes never left him. They bore into him like they knew everything, like they were pulling him apart piece by piece. "You can't leave," the voice echoed inside his mind, a whisper that rattled his skull. It wasn't just her voice. It was the voice of the road itself, of everything around him. The world seemed to bend under its weight, the trees outside twisting and stretching into grotesque shapes, shadows stretching impossibly long, as if they were alive. His vision blurred, the edges of reality starting to slip away like a film peeling off a surface. Charlie fought to stay conscious. He pressed his foot to the gas pedal again, desperate to move, but the truck remained immobile, as if the very road itself had swallowed it whole. His pulse quickened, panic surging through him. The woman was closer now, her fingers brushing against the seat next to him. Her touch felt cold, like death itself, and for a moment, he wondered if he had already crossed some invisible line between life and the grave. She smiled then, a slow, deliberate motion, her lips curling into something cruel, something that was far from human. He looked back at the road ahead, trying to ignore her presence, but it was impossible. The world outside was no longer the highway he had been traveling. The road twisted and turned in unnatural directions, like a serpent winding through a maze, and the trees, no longer recognizable, stood like silent sentinels watching, waiting. The sky above had darkened into a sickly shade of gray, and in the distance, he thought he saw something moving, something large, something waiting. His hands shook as he reached for the door, pulling the handle with desperate urgency. Maybe, just maybe, he could run. Maybe he could escape whatever this was. But as his fingers touched the cold metal, a wave of dizziness hit him, and he had to steady himself. The air was thick now, heavier, and it felt like something was pushing against him, forcing him to remain still. A sudden shriek, like the sound of metal scraping against stone, ripped through the air. Charlie's head snapped toward the source, his heart skipping a beat. He could barely make out the shape of something large moving just outside the truck, something tall, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. The woman's voice rose again, now louder, more insistent. "You can't leave. You will never leave." The world around him seemed to close in, the space in the truck growing smaller, more suffocating. The trees outside were no longer static but moved, shifting in unnatural ways, bending as if they were alive, watching him. The darkness was alive now, feeding on his fear, wrapping around him like a cold, suffocating blanket. Charlie's head spun, the edges of his vision blurring with every breath. In the rearview mirror, something moved, something that wasn't supposed to be there, and yet it was. Charlie's grip on the steering wheel tightened even more, the muscles in his arms trembling with the strain. He tried to ignore the growing sense of dread gnawing at him, the way it crept into his chest and took root in his heart. He had to focus. He had to get out of here. He turned his eyes back to the rearview mirror, his breath catching in his throat. At first, he thought it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, but no, it was there. The movement. Slowly, it grew clearer, the shape becoming more distinct. A shadow, a silhouette of something, someone, standing in the middle of the road behind him. His mind raced. Couldn't be real. He had to be hallucinating. But the longer he stared, the more it became undeniable. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall. It didn't move like a person should. It didn't walk. It glided, its long limbs stretching as if they were floating just above the ground. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, and though it was far in the distance, Charlie could feel its eyes on him. The same eyes that were haunting his thoughts. It was real. Charlie's breath quickened. His pulse thundered in his ears. What the hell was going on? He had to escape. But escape where? The road had become a labyrinth, a never-ending stretch of twisted asphalt that led to nowhere. He slammed his foot on the gas, but again, the truck remained still, as if it had been paralyzed by the very thing he was running from. A chill ran down his spine as the shadow in the rearview mirror grew closer. No matter how fast he pushed the pedal, no matter how hard he fought against the truck's refusal to move, the shadow was always there, always following. Then he heard it, another sound, faint at first but unmistakable. A voice calling out from the darkness. It wasn't the woman's voice this time. No, this voice was deeper, almost growling, like something far older than the woman. Something that had been waiting in the dark corners of the earth for centuries. You are mine now. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a declaration that sent shivers down his spine. A chill crept across his skin, and for a moment, he thought he might suffocate in the thick, heavy air. God, no, I won't die here, Charlie whispered to himself, shaking his head. He couldn't give in. He couldn't let it win. He refused. But as the shadow drew closer, the temperature in the truck dropped even lower, and the air became impossibly thick. It felt like a weight was pressing down on him, as if the very atmosphere was suffocating him. The woman's voice returned, louder now, her tone sweet yet venomous. You've always been mine, Charlie. You've always been lost. It's just time for you to realize it. Charlie's pulse quickened. He looked at the woman sitting next to him, her cold gaze never leaving him. The darkness in the rearview mirror was almost upon him now. He had no choice. He opened the door. But before he could step out, a force yanked him back, dragging him by the collar as though an invisible hand was gripping him from behind. The truck lurched forward with a sudden, jerking movement, and for a moment, Charlie was free, thrown into a strange weightlessness. The air exploded with a deafening crack, like thunder split the sky. The truck jolted again, almost as if it was shaking violently. The darkness around him deepened, but something shifted. The ground beneath him started to feel wrong, as if he was no longer on the road at all. There was no more highway, no more trees, no more familiar road signs, just an endless void, stretching out in every direction. The world, as Charlie had known it, was gone. There was no escape from this place. The shadow was closer now. In the distance, Charlie could see the eyes, glowing red, emerging from the blackness. It was no longer a figure. It had become something monstrous, something that should not exist in the realm of the living. Its shape was an abomination of twisted limbs and broken joints, hanging unnaturally in the darkness. The woman smiled again, her face a mask of death, her eyes gleaming with malicious delight. Charlie wanted to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. The pressure around him was too great. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The weight of the air, the pressure in his chest, it was suffocating him. And then, just as quickly as the force had pulled him back, it released him. He collapsed forward, gasping for air, but the road was gone. There was no truck, no highway, no sign of civilization. Just the woman, her pale hand outstretched toward him, and the shadow looming behind her. This was it. He was trapped. Charlie's chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, his heart hammering in his chest. He scrambled to his feet, his legs weak and unsteady, as the woman's gaze locked onto his with an unblinking stare. Her smile twisted, becoming something more unnatural, as if her lips were stretched beyond their normal limits. Her eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, empty sockets filled with an unsettling, unnatural light. His head spun. The world around him felt wrong. The air was thick, impossible to breathe, and the very ground beneath him seemed to tremble, as if it could collapse at any moment. "Why are you doing this?" Charlie's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but it rang in his ears with an eerie clarity. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she raised one pale hand, fingers curling into a grotesque gesture. Charlie could feel the air around him pulse, a strange force building between them, like the pressure before a storm. His body felt heavy, weighed down by an invisible force, and his knees buckled. But he refused to fall. He had no intention of going down like this. Desperately, he looked around, trying to focus on anything that might offer an escape. But there was nothing, just the empty, hollow void stretching in all directions, filled only with the woman and the twisted presence behind her. He began backing away, his mind racing for a plan. Think, he urged himself. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was trapped in some otherworldly place, far beyond the reach of any real escape. Then, without warning, the ground beneath him cracked. The deep rumble that followed was deafening, shaking him to his core. A fissure opened in the earth, stretching out in front of him like a yawning mouth, black and hungry. The woman's voice echoed across the void, her words a cruel whisper in the dark. "You cannot escape, Charlie. You're already lost." He felt a terrible pull toward the gap in the ground. His body jerked forward against his will, dragged by an unseen force, the same force that had taken hold of him earlier. His hands grasped the air in desperation, but it was no use. The void was consuming him, pulling him closer. A cold chill crawled down his spine, and he heard it again, the terrible guttural growl, echoing from behind the woman. It was as if the very air around him was vibrating with malice, a sound so terrifying it felt as though it came from deep within the earth itself. It was the thing that had been waiting for him. Charlie struggled against the pull, using every ounce of his remaining strength to fight back. "No!" he shouted, the words a raw scream of defiance. "I won't let you win." But the more he fought, the stronger the pull became. His feet slid closer to the gap in the earth, and despite his best efforts, he could feel himself being dragged inexorably forward. The woman stepped closer, her expression unreadable now, as if she was simply waiting for the inevitable. The presence behind her was drawing near, the heavy, oppressive weight of its power suffocating everything around him. Charlie's mind raced. There has to be something I can do. And then, as if his thoughts had reached the wrong part of the world, a sound pierced through the crushing silence. A loud, mechanical noise, like the grinding of metal on metal, followed by the distinct sound of a truck's engine revving. For a split second, his mind struggled to understand. It was impossible. His truck had vanished, the road had disappeared, and yet, there was a sound, the sound of his truck. The woman's eyes widened, a flicker of unease crossing her face. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but before she could speak, the sound grew louder, reverberating through the very air around them. Then, out of the dark void, the truck appeared, his truck. It was there, materializing as if summoned from the very fabric of reality, its headlights blazing like beacons in the oppressive night. The engine roared to life, and the truck lurched forward, its massive tires screeching against the empty air. Charlie didn't waste a second. With every ounce of strength he had left, he ran toward it, stumbling through the dark, his legs unsteady and his lungs screaming for air. The truck's door swung open, and before he could even think, he was inside. The door slammed shut behind him, and the engine roared to life. He slammed the truck into gear, his hands shaking, but determination flooding his mind. He wasn't going to be trapped here. Not today. The road ahead of him stretched out, or at least it seemed to. He didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. But as the truck sped forward, the shadows didn't disappear. The woman, the thing behind her, they were still there, following him in the darkness, their presence lingering like a specter he couldn't shake. He didn't dare look in the mirrors. He couldn't afford to. The truck rumbled forward, but Charlie felt the weight of the road pressing in around him again. This wasn't over. Not yet. Charlie's knuckles were white against the steering wheel as he pushed the truck faster. The engine's roar grew louder, but it did little to drown out the pounding in his chest, the sickening feeling that no matter how fast he drove, he wouldn't be able to outrun what was behind him. The road stretched endlessly, an infinite ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the black void. A strange, cold fog began to creep in, thickening around the edges of his headlights, making it almost impossible to see more than a few feet in front of him. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to stop, to turn around, but he knew that if he did, he would never escape. The road was alive with something, an almost sentient force, drawing him deeper into its grasp. The night air inside the truck felt suffocating, oppressive. Charlie's breath came in ragged gasps, his pulse racing. The soft hum of the tires on the pavement became a distorted drone, like an unnatural sound vibrating in his ears. He glanced nervously at the rearview mirror, but the road behind him was shrouded in darkness. He couldn't see anything, yet he felt it. Something was there, following him even if he couldn't see it. It was close. Suddenly, the air inside the truck shifted. The temperature dropped, and a shadow moved across the road, darting past the truck's headlights. Charlie's heart stopped. He slammed his foot on the brake, the tires screeching against the pavement. The truck fishtailed, veering dangerously to the side, but he fought to keep control, his hands shaking with panic. The shadow had vanished, but its presence lingered, thick and suffocating. It's just a trick of the mind, Charlie thought, trying to convince himself, but his instincts told him otherwise. Whatever was out there, it wasn't finished with him. He glanced back at the mirror once more. This time, the reflection showed something else, something more. The woman. Her pale face was distorted, her eyes wide and glowing with a sickly yellow light. Her mouth opened, stretching impossibly wide, her jaw unhinging like something not meant for this world. Her smile, if it could even be called that, was a grotesque mockery of a human expression, filled with jagged, broken teeth. Charlie's blood ran cold. His foot hit the accelerator again without thinking, the truck lurching forward, its speed increasing as he pushed it harder, faster. He had to get away, but the road ahead seemed endless. The fog thickened, closing in around him, and his headlights barely pierced through the oppressive darkness. Then, a voice, a cold whisper, slipped through the cracks of the truck's metal frame. "You can't outrun it, Charlie," the voice said, not from the radio or any source he could recognize. It came from everywhere and nowhere, seeping into his mind like a cold chill. "You're already part of it." His hands trembled, nearly losing grip on the wheel. What does that mean? The fog was nearly impenetrable now, and the truck's headlights were useless, casting strange, twisted shadows in every direction. Charlie couldn't see a damn thing, and yet he knew the road was still there, stretching endlessly into the void. He was stuck in it, stuck in something that didn't belong in the real world. He slammed on the brakes again. The truck skidded to a stop, tires screeching, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. His breath came in short, sharp gasps as he looked around in terror. The fog had grown too thick now. He could see shapes moving in the haze, indistinct at first but growing clearer with each passing second. They were all around him. Shadows shifted in unnatural ways, like creatures trying to crawl out from the darkness itself. Then he saw it. The road ahead of him was gone. It had evaporated, leaving only a vast, endless chasm of blackness. The road wasn't just an empty stretch anymore. It was a void, a tear in the fabric of reality. And just beyond it, standing motionless in the void, was the woman. Her twisted figure, her unhinged mouth stretching wider, as though eager to consume him. Her gaze bore into him, those glowing yellow eyes focused with a predatory hunger. Charlie's pulse hammered in his chest as panic took hold of him. He reached for the gear shift, his hands shaking uncontrollably. But before he could make a move, the truck jolted. Something had struck the front of the vehicle, and the whole truck tilted to one side. He slammed his hands on the steering wheel, trying to regain control, but the truck slid backward as if something had gripped it, pulling it toward the edge of the abyss. A low growl filled the air, echoing through the cab, deep and guttural. It wasn't human. The noise was unlike anything Charlie had ever heard. It sent waves of terror crashing over him, freezing him in place. As the growl grew louder, Charlie knew it was no longer just the woman. There were others, things beyond the edge of the road, waiting, watching, and closing in on him. He couldn't stay. He had to escape. With a desperate, frantic motion, he threw the truck into reverse, trying to pull away from the edge of the chasm. His hands were slick with sweat, his eyes wide with terror as he fought to regain control. But the truck wasn't moving. It was stuck. Then, just as his hope seemed to drain away, the truck lurched forward. Not on its own accord, but as if something had pushed it. A long, shrill scream filled the air, drowning out all other sounds, and Charlie knew it was coming from the thing that had been chasing him all this time. He had no choice now. With everything he had left, he slammed the truck into gear again, the engine roaring to life. But it was too late. Charlie's heart pounded in his chest as the truck finally lurched forward, the tires spinning violently against the gravel. The force of the movement seemed to break whatever supernatural grip had been on the vehicle, but it was a fleeting relief. The truck surged ahead with a strange, jerky motion, as if it was being dragged through some unseen force. He glanced at the rearview mirror, his pulse thundering in his ears. He saw nothing, nothing real. The road stretched behind him like an empty canvas, but that absence made the terror worse. He wasn't sure if he could trust the mirror or even the windshield. Everything felt warped, as though the world was flickering around him like a broken projection. The fog was closing in again, swirling and thickening until it became an all-encompassing void. Charlie's breaths were shallow, the chill in the air growing colder by the second, and still, no matter how fast he drove, he couldn't escape that sickening feeling that the road was a trap. The headlights illuminated only a small sliver of the darkness that swallowed him whole, and even that seemed to twist in unnatural patterns, stretching shadows where no shadows should be. Then, through the dense fog, he saw something, a fleeting flash of movement on the side of the road. It was a blur, just at the edge of his vision, but it was enough to make his heart race again. He could feel his mind unraveling with the thought that it wasn't just his imagination. Something was out there, something following him, closing in with each passing second. As his grip tightened on the steering wheel, a low, creaking sound reverberated through the truck. It was coming from beneath him, from the engine, from the very heart of the vehicle. It was a groan, as if the truck itself was alive, struggling to stay in motion. He glanced down at the dashboard. Fuel was low, the needle barely moving, and the lights on the panel flickered erratically. He didn't have much longer. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal harder, desperation seizing him. The truck roared forward, its engine screaming in protest. The shadows on the sides of the road seemed to shift, moving closer as if they had a life of their own, advancing with him, pushing him towards something darker. Suddenly, a chilling, rasping sound filled the air. A voice. It was not from the radio. It wasn't from outside the truck either. It was inside his head, clawing its way into his thoughts, as though it was speaking directly into his soul. "You're not leaving." Charlie's grip loosened from the wheel just slightly, his eyes wide in disbelief. He could feel his sanity slipping, his thoughts tangling with the relentless sound. The voice wasn't human, but something far older, filled with malice and endless hunger. The fog pressed harder against the truck, suffocating, and he could almost hear it whispering, urging him to stop. His foot slammed harder on the pedal, and the truck surged forward, fighting against its own impending doom. But no matter how much he pushed, the road remained the same. endless, suffocating, and pulling him deeper into something he couldn't understand. He was running out of time, and yet the road showed no signs of ending. And then, suddenly, in the distance, a faint glow, a dim, unearthly light that flickered through the fog, shining brighter than any human light source could. It wasn't a street lamp. It wasn't a house or a sign of civilization. It was something much worse. His hands trembled violently as he fought to keep the truck on the road, his vision blurry from the sweat and fear. But he couldn't take his eyes off the light. He was drawn to it, compelled by something darker than his will. As the truck crept closer to the source of the light, it became apparent that it wasn't a beacon of hope. It was an invitation. The road curved gently toward it, as though the very path itself was coaxing him forward, promising an answer, an end. But when the truck's headlights finally reached the edge of the glowing light, Charlie's stomach twisted in horror. What he saw made his blood run cold, the air in the cabin thickening, suffocating him with the realization that he had made a grave mistake. The light wasn't from a place of salvation. It was the glow of something ancient and wrong, a portal to a place he was never meant to enter. The source of the glow was not a structure or any physical object. It was the road itself, the very earth beneath the tires, pulsing with an unearthly energy. He could see the outlines of figures, but they weren't human. The air shimmered as the road ahead warped, bending in unnatural ways. The truck's wheels lost traction, and with a sickening lurch, it began to slide toward the center of the light. Charlie screamed, trying to pull the truck back, but the steering wheel was stuck, the truck refusing to move in any direction other than toward the blinding radiance. His heart raced, his breath ragged as he pounded the wheel in sheer panic. There was no escape. The glow intensified, and the truck lurched forward into the light, the road beneath it now a churning abyss, swallowing everything in its path. His mind screamed as the world around him twisted, everything collapsing into that unholy radiance. And just as he thought the light would consume him completely, he saw the woman again. Only now, she was no longer a twisted specter. She was whole. She was smiling, and her mouth, impossibly wide, seemed to stretch across the endless expanse of the road. And in that smile, Charlie saw everything. The road wasn't just cursed, it was a gateway, and he had been its final passenger. The truck lurched forward, the sound of the engine roaring in an attempt to break free of whatever invisible force was pulling it. The headlights flickered erratically, casting strange shadows across the road as it descended into chaos. The pressure in the air thickened, making each breath feel heavier, as if the very atmosphere was alive, suffocating, wrapping itself around everything in its path. The glowing light ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, an unholy beacon pulling everything toward it. It was no longer just a faint flicker in the distance. Now it dominated the view. The truck's tires screeched against the pavement, desperately trying to escape, but every turn felt futile. Every attempt to steer left or right met with resistance. The road had transformed. What was once a straight and familiar highway now twisted and distorted, bending in ways that should have been impossible. The sound of the engine gave way to an eerie silence as the truck moved forward, its tires almost gliding, as if the asphalt beneath them had melted into a strange, liquid state. There was no sound of gravel, no rumble of the engine, just the unnatural hum of the unseen force that was now in control. Then, the air shifted again. A cold gust of wind howled through the cabin, bringing with it a scent, musty, damp, like the earth after a storm. But there was something else too, something rotten. The stench of decay, of something long dead, lingered in the air, making the stomach twist with disgust. The dashboard lights blinked once more, flashing like warning signs in a nightmare. The glow ahead brightened, no longer comforting but disorienting. The road, if it could still be called that, seemed to stretch endlessly, with no end in sight, no sign of anything familiar. It was as if time itself had collapsed in on itself. And then the truck hit a bump, a strange, sharp jolt that nearly threw the driver from their seat. For a moment, there was a glimpse of something just beneath the surface of the road, shifting, writhing. A shadowy mass, like it was alive or perhaps dead, but undeniably present. For the briefest moment, there was clarity. The truck was no longer part of the physical world. It had passed through the veil into something else. The glow intensified, now filling the cabin. It was no longer just light, it was warmth, it was heat, and it was suffocating. The temperature in the truck rose suddenly, too quickly to be natural. The air was thick with a pressure that made it difficult to breathe. But what was worse, the light was pulling everything around it. The truck's steering wheel began to twist on its own, turning in sharp, jerking motions as if it, too, were succumbing to the force. The sudden realization hit. The road was no longer a road. It was a trap, a cycle that had claimed countless others before, its grip now tightening with every passing second. Every movement forward led deeper into the center of the light, and every attempt to escape only pulled the vehicle closer. The truck's horn blared, an attempt to break free from the hypnotic pull, but the sound quickly became muffled, swallowed by the surrounding hum. The once crisp air was now thick, as if something was closing in from all sides, smothering everything in its path. A screeching, high-pitched noise pierced the air, unnatural and harsh, like the sound of metal scraping against metal, only it came from all directions at once. And then, through the distortion, a shape began to emerge. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a creature either. It was something else, something that existed in the gaps between the physical world and whatever lay beyond. The shape shimmered, fluctuating, neither solid nor fleeting. It was an entity that seemed to draw its form from the very fabric of the road itself, growing taller, darker, and more menacing with each passing second. Its presence was overwhelming. The truck's engine sputtered, unable to move, the wheels locked in place as if anchored by invisible chains. There was nowhere to go. The air grew even colder. It was a biting cold that seemed to freeze the very breath in the chest, seizing every muscle, making it impossible to move. The lights flickered once more. This time they didn't return. The world outside was swallowed entirely by the glow, the harsh light flooding the truck like a tidal wave. And just when it seemed that the cabin would collapse in on itself, when the pressure had become too much to bear, the entity, whatever it was, shifted again. Its form broke into shapes that weren't meant to be understood, too strange for the human mind to fathom. It leaned closer. There was no sound, no words, just the presence. The light seemed to pulse with rhythm, like a heartbeat. It reached out to envelop the truck, to devour the very essence of everything inside. A voice, raw and primal, whispered inside the truck, just at the edge of consciousness. It wasn't words. It wasn't even language. It was a sound so ancient, so visceral, that it made the spine tingle and the heart race. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the air snapped back to silence. The truck stood still, suspended in the midst of the light. Everything outside was still. The road stretched ahead, but now it was darker than before, like a shadow, too deep to comprehend. But no matter how long the truck sat there, the presence, that energy, was still there, ever present, waiting. It wasn't over. Not yet. The road hadn't finished with them yet. The truck trembled, its engine coughing as if it had been trapped in the grip of something far beyond human comprehension. The entity, now pulsating in front of them like a dark sun, seemed to grow more aware of the truck's desperate presence. Each second that passed felt like an eternity, but in that stillness something shifted, something in the air, something that couldn't be seen but could only be felt. It was an overwhelming, suffocating awareness, as if the road itself was alive, breathing down on them, waiting. The trucker's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles went white. His heartbeat echoed in his chest, a rhythm that felt both like his own and yet somehow wrong. His eyes darted around, searching for any escape, but the road stretched out endlessly, a void that had no beginning and no end. There was no turning back, no way to fight this thing. The temperature plummeted once more. Frost began to creep across the windshield, like ice forming not from the cold, but from the presence of something ancient, something far older than the world itself. The entity, with its shifting mass of form and shadow, seemed to expand, folding inward as if preparing to consume the very air around them. The The truck's engine died. A voice, distant but unmistakable, slithered into the driver's mind. It wasn't words, not in any language he knew, but it was a presence, an unmistakable intent, something ancient, something primal. It was as if the road itself had whispered to him, urging him to accept the inevitable. A shift. The light from the entity pulsated, its glow taking on a sickly hue, now drowning the truck, wrapping it in its suffocating embrace. The very air began to warp. The road beneath the tires twisted, folding like paper, as if the ground itself was tearing apart. The truck remained suspended, the driver unable to move, unable to escape. It was no longer just a truck on a road. It was something else entirely. A vessel, a trap. The ghostly presence, sensing the trucker's desperation, lunged forward, its energy pressing down on him, suffocating his lungs. It wasn't just a ghost. It wasn't just a spirit of the dead. It was the very embodiment of this place, of this road, of something far more ancient and powerful than he could have ever comprehended. In that moment, everything in the truck went cold. Not just the air, but the very essence of reality seemed to freeze. Time itself twisted, bending and warping around them, until the world outside disappeared entirely. There was nothing. No road, no night sky, no stars, just the presence, just the void. The driver tried to scream, but no sound escaped. His vision blurred. The walls of the truck began to flicker like a dying light bulb, breaking apart as though they were no longer part of this world. And then, a jarring sensation. The light, the presence, everything stopped. It was as if the whole universe held its breath for a moment. The truck, along with everything in it, was thrown violently back into reality. The truck was no longer on the road. There were no signs of the entity, no trace of the strange distortion in the air. The lights of the truck shone brightly once again, cutting through the night. But something was wrong. The road was too still, too quiet. He checked the rearview mirror, expecting to see the familiar stretch of dark highway behind him. Instead, there was nothing. An empty black void. No stars, no light, no moon. The road, had it even been real? The trucker's eyes darted to the side, and he gasped. The empty passenger seat, where he had left nothing but a pile of empty wrappers, was now occupied. Not by a person. No, it was filled with the thick, suffocating air that had enveloped them earlier. The space seemed alive, pulsing, and in the rearview mirror, just over his shoulder, the faint outline of something shifted, like a shadow not cast by the truck itself, but something inside the world. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, feeling his heart race as the engine roared to life once again. The road stretched out in front of him, but with each passing mile, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him, just behind him, just out of sight. The haunting stillness remained, and the pressure continued to grow. The road had let him go, but the ghost of the place, of the thing that lurked just beyond the fabric of reality, had not. He was never going to leave it,